The screen of the old tablet Natalie left in my guest bedroom had a small crack in the lower left corner, a jagged hairline fracture that distorted the words beneath it. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night. Outside, the November wind was pulling the last dry oak leaves from the branches, throwing them against the kitchen window with a sound like fingernails tapping on glass. I had sat down to check my bank balance before going to bed. For 3 years since my husband Curtis passed, my routine had not varied. I turned off the hallway lights, kept the kitchen bulb on, the low-wattage yellow one that didn't hurt my eyes, and sat at the table with my notebook. It was a small, leather-bound ledger where I kept track of 3 separate utility accounts. None of them belonged to me. One was for my son Mitchell's house in the suburbs, the 2-story colonial with the heated floors he and his wife, Cheryl, insisted they needed for the kids. The second was for my daughter Natalie's apartment downtown, a place with high ceilings and drafty single-pane windows that let the winter cold leak in like water. The third was the water bill for Natalie's boutique, a business that spent more time in the red than the black. I didn't pay the entire balances every month. I couldn't afford that on my part-time clerical salary and Curtis's modest pension. But I paid oft enough to keep the red letters off their notices. I paid $50 here, $100 there, logging directly into their accounts with the passwords they had given me years ago during their emergencies. Mitchell's emergency had been a transition between jobs. Natalie's had been a broken furnace during a record freeze. The emergencies had ended, but my logins never did. Neither of them ever asked me to stop. They simply stopped mentioning the bills altogether, as if the municipal water and the natural gas that warmed their children's bedrooms were municipal gifts falling from the sky like rain. The tablet on the table hummed. It was synced to Natalie's old cloud account, something she had forgotten to sign out of when she gave it to me, so my grandson Leo could watch cartoons when I watched him on Fridays. A notification popped up at the top of the glass. It wasn't a standard text. It was a link to a shared group thread on a platform they called Discord, a digital room where my children, their spouses, and 2 of their cousins spoke to one another daily. I shouldn't have clicked it. A well-mannered woman of my generation doesn't look at mail that isn't addressed to her. But my name was in the preview. "Did Denise do the gas yet?" Cheryl had written. I sat very still. The refrigerator clicked, its motor beginning its long midnight cycle. I put my glasses on, adjusting the wire frames behind my ears, and scrolled upward. The conversation had begun 3 days earlier, on Sunday, right after they had all come to my house for pot roast. Mitchell. I checked the portal. The electric is still showing 180. Did anyone mention the draft in the kitchen to her? Natalie. I did. I told her the baby was shivering during her nap. She got that look on her face. You know, the quiet, worried one where her mouth goes thin. Cheryl. Perfect. That means she'll log in by Monday night. I swear, it's like clockwork. You just have to say the word cold 3 times in her kitchen, and she runs to her checkbook. Mitchell. It's honestly hilarious. She thinks she's saving us from the streets. If she knew we spent that exact amount on dinner at the steakhouse Friday, she'd probably have a stroke. Natalie. Let her have her little savior complex. It makes her feel useful. Otherwise, she'd just be sitting in that dusty house wallowing about Dad. It's charity, really. We're doing her a favor by letting her feel needed. Cheryl, just don't let her see the new espresso machine when she comes over to watch the kids next week. We'll have to hide it in the pantry. If she thinks we have money, the free water gets shut off. I read the words again. Then I read them a third time. My eyes didn't water. When you reach 63, your body seems to husband its fluids more carefully. There is no sudden rush of heat, no dramatic gasp. There is only a slow, cold settling like silt reaching the bottom of a well. I looked down at my hands. The knuckles were slightly swollen from 30 years of typing medical codes into county computers. The skin dry around the nails. On my left ring finger, the gold band Curtis had bought me in 1984 was thin, worn down by decades of dishwater and laundry detergent. I had skipped my own dental cleaning last month because Mitchell's sewer tax had been due. And he had mentioned offhand at Sunday dinner how tight things were with the kids' soccer fees. I had eaten soft foods for 2 weeks to avoid irritating the molar in the back that had begun to ache. I looked back at the screen. Natalie, she's like the ghost in the meter. You don't see her, but the lights stay on. Mitchell, the silent matriarch. Long may she pay. There was an emoji after his message, a small cartoon yellow face laughing so hard it was crying. I closed the app. I didn't log out. I left the tablet on the table, exactly where it was, its screen slowly darkening until it became a black mirror, reflecting the yellow ceiling fixture above me. A woman can spend 30 years building a home, raising children, smoothing down the sharp edges of their lives, only to realize she was never actually invited inside. She was merely the scaffolding. Once the structure is strong enough to stand, the scaffolding is just something gray and iron that spoils the view. I stood up, my knees making their familiar, dry click in the silence of the empty kitchen. I took my ledger, the one with the neat rows of dates and figures, and I walked over to the trash can beneath the sink. But I didn't throw it away. That would have been an act of anger, and anger is an active emotion. It requires energy. It requires a belief that the other person might care enough to notice the gesture. Instead, I took the ledger back to the drawer by the telephone, placed it inside, and slid it shut. I walked down the hall, turned off the kitchen light, and let the house go dark. On Wednesday morning, the sky was the color of dirty slush. I drove to work with the heater in my 10-year-old sedan, blowing dry, dusty air onto my ankles. My job at the county medical billing office was located in the basement of the municipal annex, a windowless room where 4 of us sat under the low buzz of fluorescent tubes. For 22 years, my days had been measured in codes, ICC-10 codes. If a patient had a sprained wrist, it was S63O. If they had a broken heart, there was no code. But if they had chronic, unspecified sadness, it was F32.9. We translated human suffering into 6-character strings of letters and numbers, so that giant, distant corporations could decide exactly how much that suffering was worth in dollars. It was clean. It was cold. It taught me that everything eventually is reduced to a ledger. At 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the desk next to my keyboard. It was a text from Mitchell. "Hey, Mom," Cheryl said, "the kids are asking when they're seeing you next." Also, just a heads up, our electric bill is crazy this month, nearly $200. I don't know how they expect working families to survive. Hope you're staying warm. In the past, my response would have been automatic. I would have typed, "Don't worry, Mitch. Let me take care of that for you. Tell the kids I love them." Then I would have opened my banking app, transferred $200 from my savings, the money Curtis had left for emergencies, and felt a warm, quiet swell of satisfaction. I would have believed I was the silent engine keeping my son's life running smoothly. Now I looked at the text. I saw the hook. The reference to the grandchildren was the bait. The complaint about the bill was the line. They had been fishing this way for years, and I had always swallowed it, grateful for the tug on the other end. I didn't reply immediately. I let 30 minutes pass. Then I typed, "It is cold. Make sure the kids wear their heavy coats." I laid the phone face down on the desk. Beside me, Clara, a woman who had worked the adjacent desk for 15 years, was peeling an orange. The sharp, bright scent of citrus cut through the stale office air. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You okay, Denise? You're typing slower than usual." "Just a bit stiff today, Clara," I said. My voice sounded flat, even to me. "The cold gets into the joints." "Tell me about it," she sighed, throwing a spiral of orange peel into her metal trash can. "My daughter called last night. Wanted to know if I could cover her car insurance again. It's always something, isn't it? You raise them, you think you're done, but the hand just stays out." "We teach them to keep it out," I said quietly. Clara stopped chewing, looking over at me with a slight frown. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," I said, my fingers returning to the home row of my keyboard. F32-9, unspecified sadness. "Just that we make it too easy for them to forget we're real." I finished my shift at 1. When I got home, Natalie's car was idling in my driveway. It was a sleek, late-model crossover she had leased 6 months ago, despite her complaints that her boutique was barely paying its commercial rent. The exhaust rose in thick, white plumes in the cold afternoon air. She rolled down her window as I parked beside her. "Mom, thank God. I've been waiting 20 minutes. I left my tablet here on Sunday, and I need it for a client presentation tonight." She didn't get out of the car. She sat in the heated leather seat, her scarf draped perfectly around her throat. A paper cup from the expensive coffee shop downtown sitting in her console. "Come inside, Natalie," I said, stepping out into the wind. "It's on the kitchen table." She let out a soft theatrical sigh, checking her watch before killing the engine. "Just for a second. I'm on a crazy tight schedule." We walked into my house. The hallway smelled of the cinnamon pine cones I kept in a bowl by the door. A scent Curtis had always liked because it reminded him of his grandmother's cabin. Natalie didn't notice. She marched straight to the kitchen, her high-heeled boots clicking sharply on the linoleum. She grabbed the tablet from the table. I watched her thumb find the power button. Her eyes darted quickly across the screen, her thumb moving with a practiced, nervous speed as she checked her open applications. She was looking to see if I had opened the Discord app. I stood by the counter, my coat still zipped to my chin, my hands in my pockets. "Did you find everything you needed?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, her chest rising in a small breath of relief as she realized the app was closed. She slipped the tablet into her leather tote bag. Awesome. Thanks for keeping it safe. She turned to leave, but then she paused, looking at me with that familiar, tilted head expression of simulated concern. You look tired, Mom. Are you sleeping okay? I sleep fine, Natalie. Are you sure? Mitchell said you seemed a little off in your text today. We're just worried about you. You've been so quiet lately. It was a beautiful performance. She was setting the stage, preparing the ground for the next request. I could see the gears turning behind her, carefully made-up eyes. She wanted to mention the boutique's gas bill. It was due next Tuesday. I'm just 63, I said. Sometimes quiet is all there is left to be. Natalie laughed, a quick, nervous sound. Oh, stop! You're not old. Anyway, I have to run, but hey, I was thinking, maybe we could do dinner next week? My treat. Well, once the boutique gets through this slow patch, right now, every single dollar is basically spoken for. It's so stressful. She looked at me, waiting. She was waiting for me to say, don't worry about dinner, sweetie. And let me help with the shop's bills this month. I don't want you stressed. The silence stretched between us. It was a heavy physical thing. In the past, I had always rushed to fill the silence, terrified that if I didn't offer help, she would leave and not come back for weeks. I had bought their presence with my silence and my savings. But today, I just stood there. I let the silence settle on her shoulders. Natalie's smile faltered slightly. Her eyes flicked down to her boots, then back to my face. Mom, are you sure you're okay? I'm very sure, I said. Okay. She backed toward the hallway. Well, I'll call you tomorrow. Love you. Goodbye, Natalie. I didn't say, I love you too. I hadn't realized until that moment how much of an effort those 4 words had become, how much they felt like a contract I was signing with a pen that had run out of ink. After she left, I went to my computer in the small alcove off the living room. I opened the browser. I had bookmarked 3 utility accounts: Mitchell's electric, Natalie's water, and the boutique's gas. Mitchell's electric bill was due on Friday. The total was $214.50. I looked at the login screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then I closed the tab. I shut down the computer. In 36 hours, the automated system at the utility company would send Mitchell a notification. It would be the first time in 44 months that his balance had not been cleared 48 hours before the due date. I walked back to the kitchen, sat at the table, and began to peel a potato for my dinner. The kitchen was very quiet, save for the steady, rhythmic scrape of the peeler against the skin. On Thursday afternoon, I went to the supermarket. It was the large, brightly lit chain store on the edge of town, the one with the polished concrete floors that reflected the overhead glare like ice. I stood in the dairy aisle, comparing the prices of butter. The brand I usually bought had gone up 40 cents. I stared at the yellow packages, doing the mental math, weighing 40 cents against my weekly budget, when I heard a familiar laugh from the next aisle over. It was Cheryl. I stepped back quietly, positioning myself behind a display of organic yogurts, and watched through the gap in the shelving. Cheryl was pushing a shopping cart that was already half full. She was on her phone, her wireless earbud tucked into her blonde hair, laughing as she tossed items into the basket without looking at the price tags. I know, right? she was saying to whoever was on the other end of the call. But I told him, we're not skipping the ski trip just because of some utility increases. We'll figure it out. We always do. She paused, listening, then reached down and picked up 2 cartons of imported berries, the ones that cost $8 a pint out of season, and dropped them on top of a stack of premium ribeye steaks. "Oh, please," Cheryl scoffed gently, turning her cart toward the bakery section. His mom always steps in. She's like a safety net we don't even have to ask for. Mitchell just complains a little about the heating bill when she's over. And by Tuesday, it's handled. It's honestly so easy. My hand, still resting on the shelf near the butter, felt very cold. I didn't move. I waited until she had turned the corner before I walked out of the dairy aisle. I didn't want a confrontation. A confrontation would have given her a chance to explain, to apologize, to smooth it over with a hug and a promise that she hadn't meant it that way. I didn't want her apologies. Apologies are just the loose soil people throw over a pit they've dug, hoping you'll step on it again. Instead, I took my store-brand butter, paid my $14 at the self-checkout, and went home. Friday evening arrived with a quiet, heavy rain that turned the gravel in my driveway into dark charcoal. At 6:15 p.m., my landline phone rang. I kept the old kitchen wall phone because Curtis had liked the reliability of it during winter storms. I let it ring 4 times before I picked it up. "Hello, Mom?" Mitchell's voice was tight. I could hear the sound of his windshield wipers in the background. He was driving home from work. "Hey, I got a weird alert from the electric company. A past due notice." "Did you?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "Yeah. It said the payment was due by 5 today, and it never went through. I thought you usually took care of that around mid-month." I checked the portal, and it was still showing the full balance. "Did something happen with your bank? A glitch or something?" He was giving me an out. He was offering me a way to apologize to him for my oversight. "No glitch, Mitchell," I said. Voice was very calm. The same tone I used when I had to tell patients their insurance didn't cover their procedures. "My bank is working perfectly." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the rhythmic slap-slap of his wipers. "Oh," he said. He sounded confused, like a man who had walked up to a door he'd opened 10,000 times, only to find it locked from the inside. "Well, I had to pay it. Just now on my phone in the parking lot. It was $214, Mom. It completely wiped out the cash I had set aside for the kids' weekend soccer tournament dinner." "I see," I said. "Cheryl had to cancel our reservation," he continued, his tone shifting from confusion to a subtle, defensive irritation. "The kids were really looking forward to it. If you weren't going to do it this month, you could have given us a heads up. We rely on that schedule, Mom. It's not really fair to just drop it on us at the last second. We rely on that schedule." He didn't say, "Thank you for paying it for the last 44 months. He didn't say, "I'm sorry we let you carry that weight." He said schedule. He spoke of my sacrifice as if it were a transit system, and I was the conductor who had late-paying passengers waiting on a cold platform. "A mother's sacrifice is a strange thing, Mitchell," I said quietly, looking out the kitchen window at the rain. "People rarely notice it until it stops. And then they don't treat it as a gift that has ended. They treat it as a theft of what they were owed. What is that supposed to mean? His voice sharpened. Are you lecturing me? Over $200? Mom, we're your family. We're struggling here, and you're acting like we're trying to rob you. I didn't say you were robbing me, Mitchell. I just said the bill was yours, and now it's paid. That's a good thing, isn't it? Yeah, but the way you're doing this, it's weird. You're acting weird. Natalie said you were acting cold to her on Wednesday, too. He let out a harsh, frustrated breath. Look, we're having Sunday dinner at our place this week. Cheryl's making lasagna. Let's just talk then, okay? You need to get out of that house. You're spending too much time alone. Lasagna sounds nice, I said, but I won't be able to make it this Sunday. The silence on the line was different this time. It wasn't just confused. It was heavy with a sudden, sharp realization. What do you mean you can't make it? He asked. You always come on Sunday. I have some things I need to attend to here, I said. Have a good dinner, Mitchell. Before he could answer, I gently placed the receiver back onto its cradle. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, the black phone on the wall looking like a small, dead bird. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. For the first time in 5 years, the air in my own kitchen didn't feel thin. On the counter, my cell phone screen lit up. A text from Natalie. Mom, Mitchell just called me. What is going on? I didn't open the message. I walked into the living room, sat in Curtis' old armchair, and picked up my knitting. The wool was gray, thick, and warm. I began to knit, row by row, ignoring the quiet, persistent hum of the phone on the kitchen counter. Saturday morning arrived with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops with a vinegar-soaked cloth, when the doorbell rang. It was barely 9 o'clock. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Natalie stood on my porch, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her oversized woolen coat. She held a pink cardboard box from the French bakery near her apartment. A small, grease-stained circle was already forming on the bottom of the cardboard. I brought those almond croissants you like, she said as I opened the door. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped past me, her boots leaving damp, dark tracks on the entryway rug. I closed the door behind her. I didn't tell her that I hadn't eaten almond croissants in over a decade. Curtis had been the one who loved them. I had always found them too sweet, the almond paste thick and cloying like wet dough. But Natalie had never noticed which of us ate them. To her, a pastry was simply a pastry, a physical token of politeness she could brandish like an entry visa. Put them on the table, Natalie, I said, hanging her coat on the peg by the door. She walked into the kitchen and set the box down. She was already looking around, her eyes scanning the countertops, the sink, the small pile of mail near the toaster. She was looking for signs of decay. When children begin to suspect their mother is pulling away, their first instinct is to look for senility. They want to believe the withdrawal is a medical issue, a biological failure of the brain, rather than a conscious choice of the heart. Mitchell called me 3 times last night, Mom, she said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. She didn't ask if I wanted a croissant. She opened the box and took one herself, tearing off a flaky corner with her fingers. He was really upset. He said you hung up on him. I didn't hang up, I said, filling the kettle with tap water. I finished the conversation, and then I placed the receiver down. That's semantics, Mom, and you know it. Natalie chewed, her brow furrowing with that practiced, maternal irritation she usually reserved for her employees. He said you were lecturing him about sacrifice. And now you're skipping Sunday dinner? We've had Sunday dinner every week since Dad died. It's our thing. It's how we keep the family together. It's how you keep me in the kitchen, I said, placing the kettle on the stove and turning on the burner. The blue flame hissed to life, licking the cold metal of the pot. Natalie stopped chewing. What is that supposed to mean? We always help you clean up. You help by carrying your plates to the sink, Natalie. Then you sit on the couch and talk about your lives while I wash the roasting pan. And then Mitchell asks if there are any leftovers he can take home for lunch on Monday. I turned to face her, leaning my lower back against the stove. It's very efficient, but it isn't a family. It's a catering service that doesn't charge. Natalie's face went pink. She set the piece of pastry back into the box. I can't believe you're being this petty. Is this about the utility bills? Because if it is, that's incredibly hurtful. We didn't ask you to pay those. You volunteered. You've been doing it for years. Yes, I said. I did. Because I believed you needed the help. I believed that by taking that small weight off your shoulders, I was letting you breathe. I thought it was an act of love. It was an act of love, she said, her voice rising slightly, losing its soft, persuasive edge. And now you're weaponizing it. Just because we had a bad month, and Mitchell had a late notice, you're punishing him. And what about me? My boutique gas bill is due on Tuesday, Mom. I have $3,000 in inventory arriving next week that I have to pay COD. If I have to cover the gas too, I'm going to be in the red. She looked at me, her eyes wide, demanding that I see her struggle. She wanted me to look at her the way I had always looked at her, as the fragile, artistic daughter who needed protection from the harsh, cold world of commerce. But all I saw was the young woman on the tablet screen, typing. We're doing her a favor by letting her feel needed. You have a very beautiful boutique, Natalie, I said quietly. The light fixtures alone must have cost several $1,000s. She blinked, momentarily derailed. What do those have to do with anything? Nothing, I said, except that they are beautiful, and they are yours, just as the gas bill is yours. The kettle began to whistle, a low, breathy hum that quickly escalated into a sharp, piercing cry. I turned around, lifted the kettle, and poured the steaming water into my teapot. The scent of chamomile rose in the steam, green and medicinal. So that's it? Natalie's voice was cold now, stripped of all its simulated warmth. You're just cutting us off? No warning? Discussion. I canceled the shared cloud account this morning, I said, keeping my back to her as I stirred the tea. The one that hosts your family photo libraries and the shared calendars. I've been paying the $80 a month for that since your father passed. It seemed a bit redundant now. Natalie stood up so fast. Her chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. You did what, Mom? All my store invoices are backed up on that drive. Mitchell's tax documents from 3 years ago are on there. The account will close at the end of the billing cycle on Monday, I said, turning around with my teacup in hand. You have 48 hours to download your files and set up your own subscription. I'm sure you can find $80 in your inventory budget." She stared at me, her mouth opened slightly, her eyes dark with a mixture of anger and genuine shock. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a mother who was acting off. She was looking at a stranger who knew her secrets. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Who told you? Did someone say something to you?" She was smart. She knew that a shift this sudden, this precise, didn't happen in a vacuum. She was trying to figure out where the leak was, who had betrayed the family consensus. "Nobody had to tell me anything, Natalie," I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. The liquid was hot, burning the tip of my tongue, but I didn't flinch. Sometimes the lights just go on, and you finally see the room you've been sitting in. She grabbed her purse from the counter, her movements jerky, her breathing shallow. "You're going to regret this, Mom. When you're sitting in this house all winter by yourself, and none of us are coming over, you're going to realize how much you threw away over a few stupid bills." She marched down the hall. The front door opened, then slammed shut with a force that rattled the small brass clock on the living room shelf. I stood in my quiet kitchen. The pink pastry box sat on the table, the grease spot on the bottom slowly expanding, darkening the cardboard. I took my tea, walked over to the table, and picked up the box. I walked to the trash can beneath the sink, stepped on the pedal, and let the box drop inside, croissants and all. Then I sat down to drink my tea. My phone on the counter was silent now. The battery, which I had forgotten to charge, had finally died. On Saturday afternoon, I went to the local nursery. It was a place I hadn't visited in 3 years, since the spring before Curtis died. The air inside the main greenhouse was warm and thick, smelling of damp soil, peat moss, and the green, sharp scent of crushed pine needles. It was quiet, save for the steady, rhythmic hiss of the overhead misting system. I spent an hour walking slowly between the rows of winter cyclamen. Their small pink and white petals turned upward like delicate ears listening for rain. I chose a single deep red cyclamen in a plain terracotta pot. It was $7. I didn't need it. It didn't keep the house warm, and it didn't fill my stomach. But as I held the cool pot in my hands, I realized it was the first thing I had bought in 5 years that was purely for my own eyes to look at. When you spend decades as a mother, your purchases are always functional. You buy the cereal the children like. You buy the laundry detergent that doesn't irritate your husband's skin. You buy the cheaper brand of soap, so there's enough left over for the school field trip. You learn to filter every dollar through the sieve of other people's needs. When I got home, I placed the red flower on the sill of the kitchen window, right above the sink. The green leaves were dark and patterned like lace. It looked small against the gray sky outside, but it was there. Sunday afternoon arrived, cold and still. Normally, by 2 o'clock on a Sunday, I would have been in Mitchell's kitchen. I would have been wearing my linen apron, the one with the faded blue stripes, standing over his stove to stir the meat sauce while Cheryl sat at the kitchen island, drinking Pinot Grigio and telling me about the drama at her tennis club. I would have been listening, nodding, and feeling a dull, familiar ache in my lower back that I always ignored. Instead, I was sitting on my sofa, reading a book. The house was so quiet I could hear the tiny, dry tick of the radiator pipes in the corners of the room. At 2:30 p.m., a heavy vehicle pulled into the driveway. It was Mitchell's black pickup truck, the large one with the chrome trim that he insisted he needed for utility, though the bed was never dirty. He didn't ring the doorbell. He knocked 3 times, loud and heavy, a sound that shook the glass panes of the front door. I opened it. He stood on the porch, his face flushed red from the cold, his heavy winter jacket unzipped. He didn't have his children with him. "Your phone is dead," he said before I could speak. "Cheryl tried calling you. I tried calling you. We thought you'd had a stroke or something." "The battery died," I said, standing in the doorway. I didn't invite him in. The cold air rushed past him, smelling of wet asphalt and his expensive cologne. I didn't feel like plugging it in. You didn't feel like plugging it in. Mitchell let out a short, incredulous laugh. He stepped forward, expecting me to move back. But I remained where I was, my hand resting firmly on the edge of the heavy oak door. He paused, startled by the resistance, before taking a half step back. "Mom, this is ridiculous. Natalie told me what you did with the cloud storage. I had to spend 4 hours last night exporting our tax documents onto an external drive. Cheryl's password manager was linked to that account, too. It's a total mess." "Then it's a good thing you resolved it," I said. "We shouldn't have had to resolve it." Mitchell's voice cracked slightly, a sound that reminded me of him when he was 14 and had failed his driver's test. "You're our mother, Denise. You don't just switch off. You don't just decide one day that we don't exist anymore." "I haven't decided you don't exist, Mitchell," I said quietly. "I've simply decided that I do." He stared at me, his eyes searching my face. He was looking for the mother he knew, the one who would look down, apologize, and offer him a cup of coffee to smooth over his anger. But that woman had left the room. "Dad would be absolutely disgusted by this," Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a lower, sharper register. He was using the ultimate card. He had always known that Curtis's memory was the anchor that kept me tied to my old life. Dad worked 50 hours a week at the plant so we could have this life. He built this family. He cared about legacy. If he knew you were cutting his kids off over a couple of $100s, he'd turn in his grave. I felt a small, cold knot tighten in my throat, but I didn't let it reach my face. "Your father worked 50 hours a week, Mitchell, because he was terrified," I said, my voice steady and low. "He was terrified of the debt you and Natalie accumulated. Do you remember when you wanted that private college? Curtis took out a second mortgage. Do you remember when Natalie's first boutique failed? Curtis paid off her commercial lease so she wouldn't have to declare bankruptcy. He didn't die of a legacy, Mitchell. He died of a heart attack at 61 because his chest was tight with 40 years of your bills." Mitchell's mouth went thin. His eyes flicked away from mine, looking past me into the dark hallway of the house. He was looking for something to strike back with, but then his gaze caught on the small cherrywood table by the stairs. On the table sat a cream-colored paper folder. It was neat, thick, and had a small silver logo in the upper corner. Vanguard Real Estate and Estate Liquidators. Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. His posture changed. the aggressive tilt of his shoulders vanishing, replaced by a sudden, sharp stillness. "What is that?" he asked, pointing a gloved finger toward the table. "Why do you have a folder from Vanguard?" "I'm having the house appraised on Tuesday," I said. "Appraised?" His voice rose, a thin thread of panic weaving through the word. "Why would you appraise it? This is our house. This is the family home. It's a 4-bedroom house, Mitchell. I'm one woman and I'm 63. I don't need 4 bedrooms. And I don't need the taxes that come with them." "You can't sell this place," he said, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to grab the edge of the door frame. "Where are we supposed to go for holidays? Where are the kids supposed to play when they come over? All of Dad's tools are still in the garage. My high school yearbooks are in the attic. Then I suggest you come and get them before the end of the month," I said, "because the liquidators are coming on Wednesday to catalog the rest." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the small, frightened child behind the expensive clothes and the large truck. He wasn't worried about his father's legacy. He was worried about the loss of his storage unit. He was worried about the end of the free hotel. "Mom, please," he said, his voice suddenly soft, almost pleading. "Let's just sit down. Let's talk about this. We can help you with the taxes. We can figure something out." "We had 44 months to figure something out, Mitchell," I said. "But you were too busy laughing about the ghost in the meter." Before he could process the words, before he could ask me how I knew, I gently but firmly pulled the heavy oak door closed. I turned the deadbolt. The brass mechanism slid into place with a heavy final click. On the other side of the wood, there was silence. Then, after a long minute, the sound of boots slowly walking down the porch steps, and the heavy rumble of his truck engine starting up in the cold afternoon. I stood in the hallway, looking at the cream-colored folder on the cherry wood table. My chest felt light. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. On Monday morning, I sat at my desk in the basement of the municipal annex. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their low, flat B-flat, a sound I had lived with for 22 years. I plugged my cell phone into the USB port of my computer to let it charge. For 2 days, it had been dead, a black rectangle of plastic and glass sitting on my kitchen counter. Within 30 seconds of the power returning, the screen began to vibrate. It didn't stop for nearly 3 minutes, 47 missed calls, 11 voicemails, 36 text messages. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't open the text messages. I knew what they contained without reading them. When a family's silent infrastructure suddenly collapses, the immediate response is a wave of frantic, noisy communication. They aren't checking to see if you are well. They are checking to see if the machine can be restarted with a few frantic kicks. The messages were a map of their panic. They began on Friday night with Mitchell's irritation, shifted to Natalie's anger on Saturday, and by Sunday evening, after Mitchell had seen the real estate folder and heard the words, "Ghost in the meter," they had devolved into a state of sheer frantic damage control. At lunchtime, I walked up the concrete stairs to the street level. The November air was sharp, smelling of cold car exhaust and damp asphalt. I bought a small container of vegetable soup from the deli across the street and ate it on a park bench, my gloved hands holding the warm plastic cup. My children believed I was acting out of spite. They believed this was a temper tantrum, a temporary emotional storm that would pass once I had punished them enough. They didn't understand that spite is a form of connection. To be spiteful, you must still care enough to want to see the look on the other person's face when you hurt them. I didn't want to hurt them. I simply wanted to stop carrying them. Monday evening was dark by 5 o'clock. When I pulled my car into the driveway, I saw another vehicle parked on the street, just beyond my mailbox. It was Cheryl's white sedan. She was waiting for me. She got out of her car as I walked up the driveway, her heels clicking softly on the asphalt. She wasn't wearing her usual bright, confident smile. She looked small, her shoulders hunched against the wind, her expensive wool coat belted tightly around her waist. She carried a small covered ceramic dish in her hands. "Denise," she said, her voice soft, tentative. "I've been waiting for 40 minutes. Your phone—" We couldn't get through. "The battery was dead, Cheryl," I said, climbing the porch steps. "I brought some of the leftover lasagna," she said, holding out the dish. "I know you didn't make it yesterday." Mitchell was in a terrible state when he got home. He didn't sleep at all. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. I didn't hold the door open for her, but she followed me anyway, closing it softly behind herself. She stood in the dim hallway, holding the warm ceramic dish like an offering to a difficult god. "Set it on the counter, Cheryl," I said, unbuttoning my coat. She walked into the kitchen, placed the dish down, and then turned to face me. The yellow ceiling light caught the lines around her eyes. Without her usual laughter, she looked her age. "Denise, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Mitchell told me what you said about the ghost in the meter. He didn't understand what you meant, but I did. I knew immediately." She took a deep breath, her hands clasping together in front of her. It was a joke, a stupid, thoughtless, private joke between siblings. You know how Mitchell gets when he's stressed. He uses humor to cope. It's a defense mechanism. The word defense mechanism sounded heavy and artificial in my quiet kitchen, like a phrase she had looked up on the internet during her drive over. "A defense mechanism is what a rabbit does when a hawk is circling," Cheryl, I said, hanging my keys on the hook by the door. "What you three were doing in that chat was not defense. It was an inventory check of an asset you thought didn't have eyes." Cheryl's face went very pale. She looked down at the linoleum, her fingers twisting her wedding ring. "We love you, Denise. We really do. Maybe we've taken things for granted. I know we have. But selling the house, cutting off the utility logins, it's so extreme. It feels like you're divorcing us." "You can't divorce people who never lived with you, Cheryl," I said. "You've lived in your home, and Natalie has lived in hers. I have lived here, in the background, like the furnace in the basement. You only think about the furnace when the air gets cold. But the furnace doesn't have an emotional life. It just burns." "But Mitchell has a right to this house." Cheryl's voice suddenly lost its submissive, apologetic tone. A sharp, defensive edge peeked through, the real Cheryl emerging from behind the mask. "He told me. When Curtis set up the family trust after his first heart attack, he put Mitchell and Natalie on the deed. Mitchell has a 20% interest in this property, Denise. You can't just sell it out from under him. He won't sign the papers." She looked at me with a tiny, desperate glint of triumph in her eyes. She thought she had found the legal wall that would stop me. She thought she could force me back into my corner with a piece of paper Curtis had signed 15 years ago. I walked over to the kitchen cabinet, opened the glass door, and took down a small blue ceramic mug. "Your father did put them on the deed, Cheryl," I said, my voice quiet, almost conversational. "Curtis wanted to make sure they were protected if something happened to me. It was a 20% share for each of them." "Exactly," Cheryl said, her chest rising. "So you need his signature to sell, and he's not going to sign, Denise. Not while you're acting like this." "But Mitchell seems to have forgotten a small transaction we made 3 years ago," I continued, pouring water from the filter pitcher into my mug. "When his logistics company was failing, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on your house, the one with the heated floors. He came to this kitchen. He sat at that very table and cried. Do you remember that, Cheryl?" Cheryl didn't answer. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opening slightly. "He needed $40,000, I said. And I had it. It was the remainder of Curtis's life insurance. I told him I would give it to him, but only if we cleared his name from the deed of this house. I didn't want this property tied up in his business bankruptcies. He signed a quitclaim deed right here, in front of a notary from the bank. I have the filed copy in my safety deposit box." The silence that followed was absolute. Cheryl looked as if she had stepped off a curb she didn't see. Her hand reached out to steady herself against the edge of the kitchen counter, her manicured nails scratching slightly against the laminate. He didn't tell me that," she whispered. "No," I said. "Mitchell doesn't like to talk about the things he loses. He only likes to talk about the things he's owed." I took my mug and walked past her, out of the kitchen, leaving her standing alone next to the cold ceramic dish of lasagna. "Tuesday morning at 10, the appraiser will be here," I said from the hallway. "If Mitchell's high school yearbooks are still in the attic by Wednesday noon, the estate liquidator will include them in the dollar box on the lawn. Have a safe drive home, Cheryl." I went up the stairs to my bedroom, leaving the downstairs lights off. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open, then click shut. Then the sound of her sedan engine starting on the quiet street, its headlights sweeping across my bedroom ceiling, like a pair of cold, white fingers before disappearing into the dark. At precisely 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, Warren, the real estate appraiser, arrived. He was a man in his late 50s with a neat gray mustache and a clip-on tie that sat slightly crooked against his collar. He carried a digital laser measure that emitted a tiny, sharp red dot, which he pointed at my living room walls. I followed him from room to room. To Warren, the house was a series of calculations. He noted the solid foundation, the outdated cabinetry, the original plaster in good condition, and the need for cosmetic modernization. He clicked his tongue as he wrote on his clipboard. "It's got good bones, Mrs. Miller," he said, stepping into the master bedroom. "But the market is tricky right now. Buyers want open concepts. They want double vanities. This layout is very 1980. "Yes," I said, looking at the faded square on the wallpaper where our wedding portrait had hung for 35 years. "It was built to keep things separate." He didn't understand what I meant. He just nodded, his laser measure clicking, as he bounced a red dot off the ceiling. To him, the house was a shell waiting to be hollowed out, its walls torn down to make room for a kitchen island and a stainless steel range. He didn't see the decades of quiet labor that had kept those walls upright. He didn't see the floorboards I had scrubbed on my knees after Mitchell had tracked in mud from the creek, or the windowsill where Natalie had dropped her sticky orange juice carton every morning before school. He finished his walkthrough in 40 minutes, shook my hand with a dry, professional grip, and promised to email the valuation report by Thursday. I closed the front door and sat on the bottom step of the staircase. The house felt lighter already, as if Warren's laser had sliced through the heavy, invisible cords of memory that had kept me pinned to this hallway. At 3 o'clock, the rumble of Mitchell's pickup truck shook the front window. He didn't come to the front door this time. He backed his truck all the way down the driveway, right up to the garage door, his trailer hitch clanking loudly in the cold air. I walked out to the garage. The air inside was damp and smelled of old motor oil, rusted iron, and the dry fertilizer Curtis had bought 4 summers ago but never used. Mitchell was already there, pulling down cardboard boxes from the high shelves above the workbench. His face was dark, his jaw set in a hard, tight line. He didn't look at me when I entered. "Cheryl is staying at her mother's," he said, his voice raw as he slammed a box of old high school trophies onto the concrete floor. "She took the kids. She thinks I've been hiding money from her for 3 years. "You were hiding money, Mitchell," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You took $40,000 from your father's life insurance to pay off your debts, and you never told your wife. You let her believe you solved that crisis through your own hard work. I did it to protect her," he shouted, spinning around, his chest heaving under his heavy jacket. "I didn't want her to worry. And you just had to pull that deed out like a weapon. You ruined my marriage, Mom. Over what? A utility bill? Are you really that vindictive?" "I didn't ruin your marriage, Mitchell. Your lies did. I simply refused to let you use my house as leverage for another lie." He stared at me, his eyes bright with a mixture of fury and a strange, desperate helplessness. He wanted to hit me with his words, to make me feel the weight of his collapsing life, but my quietness was like a wall of wet sand. Every blow he threw just sank into it without a sound. He turned back to the shelves, grabbing Curtis's old heavy-duty socket sets and throwing them into the truck bed. He reached for the vintage drill press, the heavy iron one Curtis had restored by hand, painting it a bright, clean green. "I'm taking the drill press," Mitchell said, his hand gripping the cold iron handle. "Dad wanted me to have it." "No," I said. He froze, his back still turned to me. "What do you mean, no? It was Dad's." "You don't even know how to turn it on. Your father's tools are worth about $1,200 to the estate liquidator," I said. "You may take the socket sets and the hand tools. The heavy machinery stays. It is part of the estate value." "You're selling Dad's drill press." He turned around, his voice dropping into a register of genuine disbelief. "The one he spent 3 weekends polishing? The one we used to build my soapbox derby car? You're selling that to a stranger? You spent $40,000 of his insurance money on a trip to Aruba and a new patio, Mitchell. I said quietly. If you want the drill press, you can buy it at the estate sale on Wednesday. The liquidator accepts cash and cashier's checks. He looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. He couldn't grasp the cold legal reality of what I was doing. He had lived so long in a world where my maternal guilt was his unlimited credit line, and now he was realizing the account had been closed. He turned and kicked a plastic gas can across the garage. It clattered against the wall, spilling a few dark drops of stale fuel onto the concrete. "You're sick," he muttered, grabbing his box of trophies and walking past me toward his truck. "You've completely lost your mind." As he walked past the workbench, his sleeve caught on a small, rusted tin cup where Curtis had kept old keys. The cup tipped over, sending dozens of brass and silver keys clattering across the wooden surface. Among the keys, a small white slip of paper slid out. Mitchell paused, his eyes catching the printed logo on the paper. He reached down and picked it up. "What is this?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he read the slip. "A lease agreement for an apartment in Oakhaven?" Oakhaven was a small, quiet town 2 hours north, right near the state line. My sister, Mary Ann, lived there in a modest bungalow near the lake. "I signed the lease on Saturday morning," I said, my voice steady, "before Natalie came over. It's a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of an old brick building. It has steam heat and a small balcony." Mitchell's face went pale. The reality of my departure, the physical, permanent distance of it, seemed to hit him all at once. Oakhaven wasn't a drive down the road. It wasn't a place where I could easily come over to watch the kids on a Friday night or drop off leftovers. It was another world. You're really leaving?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the phone in his pocket began to ring. He pulled it out, his thumb sliding across the screen automatically. "What?" he snapped into the receiver. I watched his face change as he listened. The anger drained out of his features, replaced by a tight gray panic. His eyes flicked to mine, then back down to the concrete floor. "When?" Mitchell asked the phone. "Did they lock the doors?" Okay, Natalie, calm down. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up his hand, shaking slightly as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Natalie's boutique," he said, his voice thin. "The gas company just arrived. They shut off the main valve at the street. She has a trunk show tonight with 50 guests, and the place is 50 degrees. They told her she has to pay the past due balance of $800 in cash or certified check before they'll turn it back on." He looked at me, his eyes wide, waiting for the motherly instinct to kick in. He was waiting for me to run inside, grab my purse, and drive downtown with my checkbook to save his sister from public humiliation. I looked at my watch. It was 3:45 p.m. "The bank closes at 5, Mitchell," I said. "You'd better hurry if you want to get a certified check before they lock the lobby." I turned and walked back into the warm house, leaving him standing in the cold garage with his hands still full of rusted keys. On Tuesday night, I did not stay home to listen to the silence of my kitchen. I drove to a small diner on the outskirts of the next town over, a place where the counter was made of worn gray formica, and the air smelled of burnt grease and cheap coffee. I sat in a booth near the back, ordering a bowl of chicken noodle soup and a cup of decaf tea. 2 booths down, a family was sitting together. A young mother, probably no older than Natalie, was frantically trying to cut up a pancake for her toddler, while her husband stared at his phone, his thumb flicking rapidly across the screen. Every time the toddler dropped a spoon, the mother reached down to clean it, her movements fast, anxious, and entirely invisible to the man sitting 3 feet away. I watched her. I saw the familiar, tight line of her shoulders, the way she didn't eat her own food because she was too busy managing the small, chaotic space around her. She was 25, perhaps 30. She was already learning the language of invisibility. She was already practicing the art of disappearing while remaining physically present. I wanted to walk over to her, place my hand on her shoulder, and tell her to eat her food. I wanted to tell her that the spoon would stay on the floor if she let it, and the world would not end. But instead, I simply paid my $7 tab, left a $3 tip on the table, and drove back to my dark house. My phone, which I had plugged in the living room, was quiet. I had set it to Do Not Disturb. When I unlocked the screen, I saw a text from Natalie sent at 6:14 p.m. I hope you're happy. The boutique is freezing. We had to cancel the trunk show. Everyone is talking. You've ruined everything I worked for. I deleted the message. I went to bed and slept for 7 hours without waking. At 8:30 on Wednesday morning, the estate liquidators arrived. The lead liquidator was a tall, soft-spoken man named Calvin. He wore clean canvas work pants and carried a roll of bright green adhesive labels. His assistant, a young woman with her hair pulled back in a neat bun, carried a handheld label printer that made a sharp, mechanical beep whir every time she entered an item. They walked through my house with a quiet, respectful efficiency. "We'll start in the dining room, Mrs." Miller Calvin said, his voice low, matching the quiet of the morning. "We'll place green stickers on everything that's for sale. If there are items you wish to keep, just let us know, and we'll mark them with red." "The only thing I am keeping is in my bedroom," I said. "A cedar chest by the window and 3 boxes of clothes. Everything else in this house can go." Calvin looked at me for a brief second, his eyes showing a flicker of professional curiosity. But he didn't press. He had likely seen this before, the sudden clean sweep of a life after a death or a divorce. He didn't know that my divorce was from my own children. They began to work. Beep whir, beep whir. By 10 o'clock, the mahogany dining table, the one Curtis and I had bought on layaway in 1989, had a small green sticker on its corner. The price tag on the digital sheet showed $400. 30 years of family dinners, Thanksgiving turkeys, birthday cakes, and homework sessions, reduced to the price of a cheap television. I was standing in the hallway, watching Calvin's assistant tag the silver teapot my mother had given me, when the front door burst open. It was Natalie. She was shivering, her face pale and devoid of makeup, her hair tied back in a messy, greasy knot. She wasn't wearing her boutique clothes. She was wearing an old, oversized gray sweatshirt that belonged to her partner, Roy. She looked smaller, stripped of the glossy professional armor she usually wore like a shield. She stopped in the entryway, her eyes darting from the green stickers on the living room chairs to the clipboard in Calvin's hand. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking with a high hysterical edge. "What are you doing to Dad's house?" "We are preparing for the sale, Natalie," I said, my voice flat. "You can't do this!" She marched toward me, her boots squeaking on the linoleum. She ignored Calvin and his assistant, who immediately and discreetly stepped into the kitchen to give us privacy. "Mom, you have to stop this. Do you know what yesterday was like for me? 50 of my best clients showed up to a store that was 45 degrees. I had to serve them lukewarm wine in coats. It was humiliating. I had to lock the doors at 6 because the pipes were in danger of freezing. I'm sorry your show was canceled," I said, "but the gas bill was your responsibility." "We didn't know," Natalie cried, her hands flying out in a gesture of pure frustration. "Mitchell told me what you said on Sunday about the ghost in the meter thing. Mom, you think we were making fun of you. You think we were exploiting you." "I don't think it, Natalie. I read your words." She froze, her eyes widening as she realized the source of the leak. Her mind went back to the tablet she had left in my guest bedroom, the small cracked screen, the open cloud account. That was Cheryl," Natalie stammered, her face turning a deep, blotchy red. "Cheryl was the one who started that joke. She's the one who's always complaining about money. And Mitchell was the one who suggested we let you pay the utilities. He told me you wanted to do it. He said you had a savior complex, and that if we paid them ourselves, we'd be hurting your feelings." She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to grab my forearm, but I stepped back, letting her hand fall through the empty air. "He lied to me, Mom," Natalie pleaded, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "Mitchell's company didn't just have a transition. He's been in debt for 3 years. He used the money he saved on his utilities to pay off Cheryl's store cards so she wouldn't leave him. He told me we were doing you a favor by letting you feel like the head of the family. I didn't know he was using you. I swear I didn't know." I looked at her. I saw the desperate scramble of a child trying to throw her brother under the wheels of the train so she could stay on the platform. She wanted me to believe she was the innocent victim of Mitchell's manipulation. She wanted to separate herself from the group chat, to pretend her laughter hadn't been recorded in blue light on a Tuesday night. "But you laughed, Natalie," I said quietly. "You called me the ghost in the meter. You said it was charity to let me feel needed." Natalie's mouth closed. She looked down at the floor, the tears staining the gray cotton of her sweatshirt. "Spent 39 hours in labor with you, Natalie," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt heavier than a shout. "I spent 10 years driving you to dance classes I couldn't afford. I sat in drafty gyms, eating stale crackers, so you could have the beautiful clothes you wanted. I didn't do those things because I had a savior complex. I did them because I was your mother. But you didn't see a mother." Cease. Calvin stepped back into the dining room, his clipboard held against his chest. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between us. "Mrs. Miller," he said softly, "the mahogany table. Should we list it with the chairs or separately?" "Separately, Calvin," I said, turning my back on my daughter. "The chairs are maple. They don't match the mahogany. They never did." Behind me, I heard Natalie let out a small choked sob. She turned and ran out of the house, the front door swinging open against the cold gray morning, letting in the damp scent of winter before it banged shut again. By 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, the estate liquidators had finished their work. Calvin handed me a carbon copy inventory sheet. 20 pages of neat, blue-inked handwriting, detailing every physical possession I owned, alongside its estimated market value. He gave me a small, professional nod. "We'll set up the tables on Friday morning, Mrs. Miller. The sale will start at 8 a.m. on Saturday. We'll have a security guard at the door to make sure people only go where the green tags are." "Thank you, Calvin," I said. After they left, I walked through the rooms. The house had been transformed into a museum of commerce. Every item, from the large oak wardrobe in the hallway to the small ceramic salt shaker on the stove, had a little green circular sticker on it. In the quiet gray afternoon light, the green dots looked like a strange, flat moss growing over the surfaces of my life, reclaiming them for the soil. I went up to my bedroom to pack the cedar chest, the one item I was keeping. The chest had been a wedding gift from Curtis's father, built from thick planks of red cedar that still held their sharp, clean, resinous scent after 40 years. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside were the small, flat deposits of my maternal life. A white baptismal gown made of cheap nylon lace. A pair of tiny, bronzed baby shoes that Mitchell had worn until his feet grew too wide. A folder of drawings Natalie had made in the 3rd grade. Dozens of sketches of horses with legs that were too long and eyes that looked like human eyes. I picked up a small, silver-plated baby spoon, its handle engraved with a faded M. I held it in my palm. It was light, cool, and meant absolutely nothing. I had kept these things because I believed they were the anchors of my identity. I believed that as long as I had the baby shoes and the drawings, I was a mother. But looking at them now, under the yellow light of my bedroom, I realized they were just dry leaves I had gathered from a forest that had burned down years ago. They were the evidence of a relationship that had existed only in my own mind. I placed the spoon back into the chest. I didn't pack the drawings. I didn't pack the baptismal gown. I left them in the chest, but I didn't lock it. I closed the lid and sat on it, looking out the window at the fog rolling off the hills. At 7:30 p.m., a soft, tentative knock sounded at the back door. I didn't open it immediately. I walked down the dark hallway, my boots silent on the carpet, and looked through the glass pane of the kitchen door. Mitchell was standing on the small back porch. He didn't have his truck. He must have parked on the street and walked up the gravel path. His shoulders were hunched, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. The yellow light from the porch fixtures showed the dark circles under his eyes, his skin looking gray and dry in the cold. I opened the door. "Mom," he said quietly, "can I come in?" "Just for a minute. It's freezing." I stepped back, allowing him to enter. He walked into the kitchen, his boots making a soft, wet sound on the linoleum. He looked around the room, his eyes catching the green stickers on the refrigerator, the microwave, the wooden chairs. He didn't offer to sit down. He stood near the counter, his hands still in his pockets. "Cheryl's lawyer called me today," he said, his voice flat, drained of the anger he had carried on Tuesday. "She's filing for a legal separation. She wants the suburban house sold, and she's demanding 70% of the equity because of financial misconduct. She thinks I've been hiding assets in a shell company because of the $40,000. I told her the truth, Mitchell, I said, leaning against the sink. I told her you spent it. I know, he said, let out a long, ragged breath that smelled faintly of stale coffee and mints. I'm not blaming you. I mean, I am, but it doesn't matter anymore. The house is going to go. The business is basically done anyway. I can't pay the commercial lease next month without another loan, and no bank will touch me now. He looked down at his boots, then up at my face. His eyes were wide, dark, with a quiet, desperate panic that I had seen in him only once before, when he was 7, and had gotten his head stuck between the iron railings of the park fence. Mom, he whispered, Natalie is going to the county courthouse tomorrow morning. She's going to file a petition to look at the records for Dad's secondary retirement account, the one at the credit union. I stood very still. The water in the pipes made a low, distant hum. That account was closed 3 years ago, Mitchell, I said. I transferred the remaining balance to my personal savings to pay for the roof repair. It wasn't closed, Mom, he said, his voice dropping so low I had to lean forward to hear him. I was the co-signer on that account. Dad put me on it when he had his first bypass surgery, so I could manage the household funds if something happened to you both. I didn't close it when you asked me to. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I took a loan against it, he said. $30,000. I used the account as collateral, I thought. I thought I'd pay it back before the bank sent a notice. But then the business went under, and I couldn't cover the interest. If Natalie pulls the records, she'll see my signature. She'll see that the collateral was liquidated last year to cover the default. She'll know I took Dad's money. I looked at him, the boy I had carried for 9 months, the man who had sat at my table every Sunday for 5 years, eating my food while he quietly drained the accounts his father had built with 40 years of sweat. When you spend a lifetime performing love through service, people begin to think the service is all you are. They do not realize that when the service stops, the love might have stopped long before. They think you are a well that will always have water, no matter how many buckets they drop into the dark. She'll file criminal charges, Mom, Mitchell pleaded, taking a step toward me, his hand reaching out, his fingers trembling. She's so angry about the boutique. She wants to hurt me. She wants to hurt you. If she finds out I took that $30,000, she'll go to the police. She's already talking to a lawyer about Esther fraud. He looked at me with a desperate, childlike hope. If you just tell her you authorized it, he whispered. If you sign a backdated letter saying the $30,000 was a gift, a private loan you approved before the account was closed. She can't do anything then. The credit union won't care as long as you say it was authorized. Please, Mom, just this once. I'll pay you back. I swear, every single cent. Just don't let her put me in jail. He was begging me to lie. He was begging his 63-year-old widowed mother to commit financial forgery to protect him from the sister he had mocked in a private chat on a Tuesday night. I looked at the green circle sticker on the kitchen table. The liquidator valued the table at $400, Mitchell, I said quietly. But the notary fee for a backdated affidavit is $50. It seems a bit out of proportion, don't you think? Mitchell's hand froze mid-air. The hope in his eyes died, replaced by a sudden, cold terror, as he finally understood the depth of the ice he was standing on. "Mom," he whispered. "Please, goodbye, Mitchell," I said. "Make sure you close the gate on your way out. The latch is loose, and I don't want the wind banging it against the fence tonight." I turned my back to him, walked out of the kitchen, and went upstairs to my bedroom, leaving him standing alone in the green-dotted dark. On Thursday morning, the fog was so thick the street lights stayed on until nearly 9 o'clock. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking tea, watching the white mist press against the window panes like a damp cloth. I thought about Curtis. He had been a good man, but he had possessed a soft, yielding heart, which is a dangerous thing in a father. It teaches children that there are no walls in the world, only doors that can be pushed open if they cry loud enough. I remembered when Mitchell was 12 and had taken Curtis's vintage pocket watch, the one his grandfather had given him, to school to show his friends. He had lost it in the playground. Curtis hadn't scolded him. He had spent 3 hours after dinner, combing through the damp wood chips under the swing set with a flashlight, while Mitchell sat inside watching cartoons. "He didn't mean any harm, Denise," Curtis had said when he finally came back inside, his knees wet and muddy, his hands empty. "He just wanted his friends to think he was special. We hadn't raised children. We had raised tourists who stayed in our lives because the room service was free and the staff didn't talk back. And I had been the head housekeeper, smoothing down the sheets, replacing the towels, and pretending the noise coming from their rooms was just the sound of them growing up." Now the hotel was closed. The staff had walked out. At 4:30 p.m., I pulled my car into the driveway after my shift at the billing office. Natalie's crossover was parked near the garage, her headlights off, her engine idling. Through the windshield, I could see her silhouette. Her forehead was resting against the leather-wrapped steering wheel, her shoulders moving in small, irregular jerks. I parked my sedan, turned off the ignition, and got out. The air was cold, carrying the sharp smell of damp asphalt and rotting leaves from the gutter. I walked over to her window and tapped gently on the glass. She started, her head snapping up. Her face was gray, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She looked at me for a long, blank moment before pressing the button to roll down the window. The warm, scented air from her heater rushed out, smelling of artificial vanilla and stale coffee. In her lap sat a thick, cream-colored manila folder with the logo of the County Teachers Credit Union printed on the tab. "He took it," she said. Her voice didn't have the hysterical, sharp edge it had carried on Wednesday. It was flat, dry, and hollowed out by a deep physical exhaustion. "He took every single cent, Mom. He used the cosigner authorization from when Dad was sick. He took out a $30,000 personal loan against the account's certificate of deposit. And then he just let the loan default. The credit union seized the CD to pay the balance last year. There's $42 left in the share account." She reached down, her hand trembling as she touched the edge of the folder. "He stole our inheritance," she whispered. "Dad worked 15 years of overtime to build that account. He always said That was the money that would help the grandkids go to college. And Mitchell he used it like a credit card. She looked up at me, her eyes desperate, begging for me to match her grief. She wanted me to grasp her hand, to cry out in shock, to join her in her fury against the brother who had betrayed us both. She wanted a partner in her anger. "I know, Natalie," I said quietly. She stared at me. Her jaw went slack, her eyes freezing in their sockets. "What?" "I know," I repeated, leaning my forearm against the damp roof of her car. "I've known for 14 months. You knew." Her voice rose, a thin thread of disbelief weaving through the words. How did you know?" "The credit union sent a notice of collateral liquidation to this house last October," I said. "It was addressed to your father's estate. Since I was the executor, the mailman delivered it to me. I opened it." Natalie gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, the skin stretching thin over the bones. 14 months ago? "Mom, that was before we had Thanksgiving here. That was before Christmas. You let him sit at our table. You let him eat our food. You watched him complain about his heating bills, and you paid them, knowing he had $30,000 of Dad's money in his pocket?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" She screamed the word, tearing out of her throat, echoing off the metal of the garage door. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call the police? He's a thief. He stole from you. He stole from me." "If I had told you, Natalie, you would have made it about yourself," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level, a cool stone in the middle of her torrent. "You would have had a big, dramatic scene in my living room. You would have screamed at him. He would have lied. And then you both would have looked at me to decide who was right. You would have expected me to fix it. You would have expected me to patch up the family so we could keep pretending on Sundays." "But he committed a crime," she sobbed, her head dropping back onto the steering wheel. "He should be in jail. He should," I agreed. But I wanted to see how long he could do it. I wanted to see how many times he could sit in my kitchen, look at his father's portrait on the wall, and ask me for $50 for the kids' shoes while he carried that $30,000. I wanted to see if there was any part of his soul that felt the weight of his father's sweat. But there wasn't. He just kept eating my pot roast. Natalie looked up, her face twisted in a mixture of anger and a sudden sharp terror. First time she wasn't looking at her mother as a victim of Mitchell's theft. She was looking at a woman who had spent over a year watching her family rot from the inside out, silently, without lifting a finger to stop it. You're horrible," Natalie whispered, her body shrinking back into the leather seat. "You just watched us. You let us think everything was fine. You let me believe Mitchell was just stressed. You're like a monster, Mom. How could you just sit there and say nothing?" "Because 30 years of speaking had accomplished nothing, Natalie," I said. "Every time I spoke, I was just smoothing down the rough edges of your lives. I was the one who made sure nobody ever had to face the consequences of their choices. I decided it was time to let the winter in. If the house is going to fall, I would rather watch it from the porch than try to hold up the ceiling with my bare hands." I reached into my pocket, pulled out my house keys, and detached a single small brass key. I dropped it through the open window onto the manila folder in her lap. "That's the key to the garage," I said. If you want to help Mitchell pack up his father's drill press, you'll need it. The liquidators will be here tomorrow morning to set up the tables. I suggest you both have your things out by then." I turned and walked up the porch steps, my boots clicking softly in the cold, thick fog. Behind me, I heard the sound of her car door slamming open, but I didn't turn around. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and let the heavy oak frame swing shut, cutting off the sound of her crying in the driveway. By Friday morning, the front lawn looked like a cemetery where the graves had been dug upward. Calvin and his assistant had set up 6 long folding tables on the grass, their silver metal legs sinking slightly into the damp, cold sod. On these tables lay the contents of my cabinets. My white ceramic plates with the faded blue rims, the ones Curtis and I had used every night since our silver anniversary, were stacked in neat towers of 8, held together with yellow rubber bands. Each stack had a small green sticker, $12. My towels. The thick green bath sheets I had bought for Mitchell when he started high school, the ones Natalie had used to wrap her hair after her Saturday night baths, were folded into neat squares, smelling of the lavender cedar chest. They were priced at $2 each. I stood on the porch, wrapped in my dark winter coat, watching a stranger write 150 cents on the back of my old silver butter dish with a black permanent marker. It is a strange thing to see your life translated into the currency of garage sales. You realize that 30 years of domestic care, of keeping things clean, of matching the saucers to the cups, is worth about $300 to a pensioned widow from down the street who wants a spare set of forks for her trailer. The emotional labor you put into maintaining the home is entirely non-refundable. At 1 o'clock, Bruce arrived. He was an older man, a retired school bus driver who ran a small hauling service with his brother. He drove a modest, dented white panel truck that smelled of old blankets and gasoline. He had a bad hip, walking with a slow, heavy hitch, but his hands were large and steady. "Just the chest and the 3 boxes, Mrs. Miller?" he asked, looking at the small pile near the front door. "Just those, Bruce," I said. "And the red cyclamen on the kitchen sill." "We'll have you loaded in 10 minutes, he said, reaching down to lift the heavy cedar chest with a quiet grunt. As carried the chest down the steps, the gravel at the end of the driveway crunched. 2 cars turned in, parking bumper to bumper behind Bruce's truck. Mitchell's black pickup and Natalie's crossover. They got out of their vehicles together. It was the first time in 3 years I had seen them arrive in the same car, walking shoulder to shoulder without bickering. The shared threat of their own exposure, the mutual panic of their financial structures collapsing, had forced them into an uneasy, toxic alliance. They looked like 2 soldiers who had spent years fighting in different trenches, now forced to share the same damp bunker because the mountain was falling. They walked up the lawn, passing the folding tables, where my plates and sheets lay under the gray sky. Mitchell had a thick manila folder in his gloved hand. His face was set in a hard, aggressive mold, the kind of expression he used when he was negotiating a commercial contract at work. "Mom," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. Bruce was behind him, carrying my first box of clothes. But Mitchell didn't move out of the way. He stood there, forcing Bruce to hover on the gravel path with the heavy cardboard box in his arms. "Excuse the mover, Mitchell," I said from the top step. Mitchell didn't look back. "He can wait a minute. We need to talk to you. Right now." "I have nothing to say to you, Mitchell. The sale is tomorrow. My move is today." "We're not letting you move," Natalie said, stepping forward. Her eyes were bright, filled with a sharp, defensive triumph. She held her phone in her hand, her thumb hovering over the screen. "We spent the morning at the county family court, Mom. Mitchell and I filed an emergency petition for a temporary guardianship." I looked at the paper in Mitchell's hand. "We told them you're liquidating your entire estate under distress," Mitchell said, his voice rising, trying to sound authoritative in front of Bruce and Calvin's assistant, who was watching from the yard. "You're 63. You're selling a mortgage-free 4-bedroom home for 40% below market value to move to a town 2 hours away. And you're cutting off all communication with your adult children." The court clerk said this is classic behavior for someone experiencing early-stage dementia or a severe psychiatric break. "We've requested an emergency injunction to halt the sale of the house until you undergo a court-ordered medical evaluation." He looked up at me, waiting for the panic. He was waiting for me to gasp, to reach for the railing, to beg them not to humiliate me in front of the neighbors. He believed he had found the perfect legal cage to keep me in. If he could prove I was crazy, the deed stayed frozen, the house stayed theirs, and the $30,000 theft from Curtis's account could be buried under a mountain of medical bureaucracy. A family that has survived on shared delusions will always treat the person who tells the truth as the primary threat, because without the lie, they have to look at each other. I reached into the inner pocket of my winter coat. I pulled out a small blue plastic folder, zipped at the top. I unzipped it, took out a single sheet of white paper, and held it out to Mitchell. "What is that?" he asked, refusing to reach for it. "That is a certified copy of my neuropsychological evaluation," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly over the damp grass. "I spent 3 hours at the county medical center last Monday morning. Dr. Mitchell, the real doctor, Mitchell, not the one in your head, performed a full cognitive battery. My score was 30 out of 30. My executive function scores were in the 98th percentile for my age group." Mitchell's face went very still. "I also executed a durable power of attorney and a healthcare proxy last Tuesday," I continued, looking from his gray face to Natalie's wide eyes. "They are both held by my sister, Mary Ann. If I am ever deemed incapacitated by a court of law, Mary Ann has sole authority over my estate, my housing, and my medical care. Neither of you will ever have legal access to my checkbook, my medical records, or this deed." Natalie let out a sharp, ragged breath, her phone slipping slightly in her hand. You planned this. You did this before we even talked to you on Saturday." "I did," I said. "Because I've spent 30 years watching you both solve your problems by taking what wasn't yours. I knew that the moment I stopped giving, you would try to steal the hands that had fed you." I looked down at Bruce, who was still standing behind Mitchell, holding the heavy box. "Bruce," I said softly, "you can place that box in the truck now. The path is clear." Mitchell looked at the white paper in my hand, then at the box in Bruce's arms, and finally at the folding tables on the lawn, where his childhood plates were priced at $12. The legal cage he had spent 24 hours building had dissolved into a handful of dust before he could even lock the gate. He stepped slowly off the gravel path, his boots sinking into the wet mud of the lawn. Natalie followed him, her head dropping, her phone going black in her palm. They stood together on the damp grass, next to a table of old tablecloths, watching in silence as Bruce loaded the final box of my clothes into the back of his white truck. The drive to Oak Haven was 74 miles of gray two-lane state highway. I kept my speed at exactly 55, my hands steady on the plastic steering wheel of my sedan. Through my windshield, the landscape changed slowly, like a film reel being run in reverse. The crowded suburban developments with their identical two-story colonials and manicured lawns fell away, replaced by flat, bald cornfields where the dry stalks lay broken in the mud. Then came the pines, dark, tall, and dense, their green needles looking almost black against the heavy, low sky. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. I knew what was behind me. A house with green stickers on the chairs and tables, and 2 adult children standing on a damp lawn, realizing for the first time that their mother had left the room. As I crossed the county line, the smell of the air changed. It became colder, sharper, carrying the damp, metallic scent of the Great Lake 3 miles north. I rolled my window down an inch, letting the chill hit my cheek. It felt clean. It felt like water on a dry throat. I arrived at my new apartment at 4 o'clock. It was located on the 2nd floor of a red brick building that had once been a small shoe factory in the 1920s. The landlord, an older man named Warren, who lived on the 1st floor, had preserved the high timber beams and the tall, arched windows that looked out over the quiet town square. My sister Marianne was already there. She was 65, 2 years older than me, with the same gray hair and quiet, observant eyes. She had lost her husband to cancer 8 years ago and had lived in Oak Haven ever since, running a small, second-hand bookstore near the harbor. She stood in the middle of my empty living room, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her oversized green cardigan. A pot of hot potato leek soup sitting on the small electric stove in the corner. "Bruce just finished unloading the chest, Denise," she said, her voice soft and familiar. She didn't hug me. We were not a family that made spectacles of our affection. We showed our love through presence, by being the person who stayed in the room when everyone else had left. He put the clothes boxes in the bedroom. "Where do you want the cyclamen?" "On the sill, Marianne," I said, zipping off my heavy winter coat. "Where the light is." She placed the terracotta pot on the deep wooden sill of the arched window. The red petals looked bright against the gray brick of the building across the street. "They're going to be furious, you know," Marianne said, stirring the soup with a wooden spoon. "Mitchell called me twice this morning. He wanted to know if I had coerced you into signing the power of attorney." He was using his professional voice, the one where he sounds like a lawyer who has never actually been inside a courtroom. "I'm sure he was," I said, sitting on the edge of my cedar chest. But Mitchell's voice doesn't carry 74 miles. It gets lost in the pines. He's desperate, Denise. Desperate people don't look at maps. They just run toward whatever is still standing. We ate our soup in silence. The steam from the bowls rose into the high, timbered ceiling, condensation forming on the cold glass of the arched window. For the first time in 5 years, the air in the room didn't feel heavy with things that hadn't been said. At 7:30, my cell phone, which I had placed on the kitchen counter, began to vibrate. I had unblocked only 3 numbers: Mary Ann's, the real estate agent's, and the local hospital. But the incoming call was from an unknown number with our old area code. I picked it up. "Hello." Denise, the voice was thin, high-pitched, and frantic. It was Cheryl. "Cheryl?" I asked, leaning my shoulder against the warm brick wall near the window. "Natalie went to the police," Cheryl said, her words rushing out in a dry, breathless pant. "She went this afternoon. She took the credit union records to the precinct on 5th Street. She filed a criminal complaint against Mitchell for grand larceny and elder exploitation." "I assumed she would," I said. "But you don't understand," Cheryl cried, the sound of her windshield wipers or a car engine loud in the background. Mitchell told the detective that you authorized the loan. He said you gave him the cosigner papers 3 years ago because you wanted him to have his inheritance early. He's claiming the $40,000 and the $30,000 were both gifts. He told them you're only denying it now because you're suffering from cognitive instability and that Natalie is manipulating you to get the house. I looked at the red cyclamen on the windowsill. One of the green leaves had a tiny drop of water on it, reflecting the yellow light of the street lamp below. "The police are going to want to talk to you, Denise," Cheryl continued, her voice dropping into a whisper that sounded like dry paper scraping against stone. "The detective told Mitchell they're going to send a deputy to Oak Haven tomorrow morning to take your statement. But that's not the worst part. Mitchell is completely unhinged. When he got back from the precinct, he packed his truck with his clothes and his father's old hunting rifle. He's furious, Denise. He's blaming you for everything. He thinks if he can just get you to sign a paper saying the money was a gift, the police will drop the charges and I'll come back to him." "Where is he now, Cheryl?" I asked. "He's on the highway," she whispered. "He left 40 minutes ago. He knows where Mary Ann lives. He knows the town. He's coming to find you." When the foundation of a house is built on a lie, even the neighbors will try to steal the timber when it finally falls. Mitchell had spent his entire adult life believing that his mother's duty was to absorb his damage, to be the soft, silent earth where his failures could be buried and forgotten. He couldn't accept that the earth had gone cold. He was coming to demand his inheritance, even if he had to carve it out of my chest. "Thank you for the warning, Cheryl," I said. "Denise, please," she sobbed. "If he does something, if he gets arrested, my kids won't have a father. Just sign the paper for the kids, please." "The kids have a father, Cheryl," I said quietly. "They just don't have a shelter anymore." I hung up the phone. I didn't turn it off. I laid it on the counter next to my empty soup bowl. Mary Ann was looking at me from the stove, the wooden spoon still in her hand. "Was that Cheryl?" "It was," I said. Before I could explain, the sound of a heavy vehicle rumbled through the quiet town square below. It wasn't the sound of a local car. It was the deep, throaty growl of a large V8 engine, the tires crunching slowly over the gravel of the parking lane directly beneath my arched window. I walked to the glass and looked down. A black pickup truck with chrome trim was idling at the curb, its headlights cutting two thick white tunnels through the Oakhaven fog. I did not run to the door. I did not lock it with a frantic, trembling hand. Instead, I walked back to the kitchen counter, picked up my cell phone, and dialed 911. My voice, when the dispatcher answered, was the same voice I used to read medical billing codes to insurance adjusters. "My name is Denise Miller," I said. "I am at the Shoe Factory Apartments, number 2B. My son, Mitchell Miller, has just parked outside. I have been informed by his wife that he is highly distressed, possibly armed with a hunting rifle, and is attempting to confront me. I would like an officer dispatched." The dispatcher, a young woman whose voice held the calm, practiced rhythm of small-town emergency services, told me to stay on the line and keep the door locked. "Units are already on the square, Mrs. Miller," she said. "They'll be there in less than 2 minutes." I hung up the phone. I didn't lock the door. If you lock a door against a desperate man, you only increase his pressure. You give him a physical barrier to focus his anger against, a lock to break, a frame to splinter. But if you leave the door unlocked, you take away his momentum. You force him to make the active, conscious choice to turn the handle and step into a room where he is not welcome. Marianne stood by the stove, her face pale, but her hands steady as she turned off the burner under the potato soup. She didn't speak. She simply picked up a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the counter and held it by the handle, her knuckles white. A heavy, rhythmic thumping sounded on the door. It wasn't a kick. It was the flat of a palm, struck 3 times against the old oak paneling. "Mom!" Mitchell's voice came through the wood, muffled but sharp with a high, tight strain of panic. "Mom, open the door. I know you're in there." "Marianne, open the door." I walked to the entryway and turned the brass deadbolt, sliding it back with a clean metallic click. I pulled the door open. Mitchell stood in the dim hallway. He looked 10 years older than he had on Wednesday. His hair was damp and wild, plastered to his forehead by the fog. He wasn't wearing his expensive wool coat. He had on a stained canvas work jacket that belonged to Curtis, the sleeves too short for his long arms, exposing his hairy gray wrists. He smelled of cold sweat, stale tobacco, and the sour, sharp scent of cheap whiskey. He didn't have the rifle in his hands. He held a crumpled white legal envelope. Mom, he gasped, stepping into the apartment before I could stop him. He didn't look at Marianne or the iron skillet in her hand. He looked only at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the pupils dilated like black beads. "You have to sign this, you have to." Natalie went to the cops. "They're calling it grand larceny, Mom. They're talking about a grand jury." He pulled a folded sheet of paper from the envelope, his fingers shaking so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves in the wind. "It's an affidavit," he said, thrusting it toward my chest. "My lawyer drafted it this afternoon. It just says you authorized the credit union loan. It says the $30,000 was a family gift, an advance on my inheritance. If you sign it," the detectives said, "they'll drop the investigation. They can't prosecute if the victim says there was no crime." "I am not signing it, Mitchell," I said. my voice quiet, standing my ground in the small entryway. "You have to," he screamed, his voice cracking, a spray of saliva catching the yellow light of the hallway. "If you don't, I'm going to jail, Mom. Do you understand that?" Jail. Cheryl is taking the kids to her mother's in Ohio. If I get indicted, I lose my license. I lose the house. I lose everything. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my winter coat. It was a pathetic, theatrical gesture, a middle-aged man begging his mother for mercy on a wet Friday night. But there was no grief in his face. There was only the raw, frantic terror of an animal that had finally run out of room to run. "I'm your son," he sobbed, his head pressing against my knee. "I'm your boy, Mom. You carried me. Dad always said you'd protect us. He always said family comes first. Please, Mom, just sign it. I'll do whatever you want. I'll pay the $30,000 back. I'll pay the utilities. Just don't let them take me away." A child who has never been told no does not see a boundary as a limit. He sees it as an insult, a personal betrayal by the person who was supposed to remain soft forever. He believes that your silence is his permanent permission, and that when you finally stand up, you are the one who is committing the violence. "Your father is dead, Mitchell," I said, looking down at his damp hair. "And he didn't tell you to steal his retirement. He built that account so we wouldn't have to beg. But you took it anyway, because you believed your comfort was worth more than his sweat." Mitchell's head snapped up. His face changed, the weeping, desperate mask dissolving in a second, replaced by a sudden dark snarl of pure hatred. He let go of my coat and stood up, his height towering over me in the small entryway. "You think you've won, don't you?" he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and sour. "You think you're so clean, moving up out here to your little brick box with Mary Ann. But you don't know what Natalie did today, do you?" I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on his. "She didn't just go to the police, Mom," he whispered, a terrible thin smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "She went to the First National Bank this morning. She still had the spare key to your safety deposit box from when you had her deposit those savings bonds last winter. She cleaned it out. She took the original quitclaim deed. She took Dad's Silver Star medal, and she took the $40,000 in physical paper bonds you had stored in there. She's gone, Mom. She's already across the state line, driving to Roy's family cabin in Ontario. She took everything you had left, and she left us both to burn." The words sat in the quiet room like a cold draft. Before I could process the image of Natalie's fingers reaching into the steel box at the bank, the quiet town square below was suddenly flooded with a brilliant, pulsing blue light. The light swept across my arched windows, turning the white plaster walls of my living room into a rhythmic, flashing sea of blue. The sound of heavy, rapid footsteps echoed up the wooden stairs of the old shoe factory. Mitchell froze, his head turning slowly toward the door, his face turning the color of wet chalk as the first heavy knock rattled the oak frame. Sheriff Wesley did not draw his weapon. He was a tall, blocky man in his late 50s, with a neat mustache and eyes that had seen 30 years of domestic disputes in Oakhaven. He stepped into the warm kitchen, his heavy boots squeaking slightly on the wood floor, followed by a younger deputy whose hand rested casually on his utility belt. "Mitchell," Sheriff Wesley said, his voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of theater. "Step away from your mother. Keep your hands where I can see them." Mitchell didn't fight. The rage that had bloated his features a moment before seemed to evaporate, leaving him looking hollowed out, his shoulders slumping under Curtis's old canvas jacket. He let the crumpled affidavit fall from his fingers. It drifted to the floor, landing near the legs of the kitchen table like a discarded wrapper. The deputy stepped behind him, his movements practiced and efficient. I watched the silver handcuffs click around Mitchell's gray wrists. It was a small, dry sound. Click-clack, no louder than the sound of a key turning in a lock. "Is his truck parked outside, Mrs. Miller?" Sheriff Wesley asked me, his notebook in his hand. "It is," I said. "His wife told me there may be a hunting rifle in the cab." "We'll check it," the sheriff said. He looked at Mitchell, then back to me. "We'll take him down to the station on the square, Mrs. Miller. The deputy will need you to sign a statement tomorrow morning, but for tonight you're safe." "Thank you, Sheriff," I said. I watched them lead him out. Mitchell didn't look back at me. He walked with his head down, his chin pressed against the collar of his jacket, his boots dragging on the wooden stairs. Through the arched window, I watched the red and blue lights of the cruiser pulse against the brick walls of the square one last time before they turned the corner, leaving the street dark and quiet once more. Mary Ann set the cast iron skillet back on the counter with a heavy metallic clink. She looked at me, her eyes dark with a quiet sisterly concern. "Denise," she said softly, "the safety deposit box, is it true?" I walked to the entryway where my winter coat hung on the peg. I reached into the pocket, pulling out my black leather keyring. I flipped through the keys. The car key, the key to the Oak Haven apartment, the key to the old house. The small silver key with the number 412 stamped on the bow was gone. I stood there, looking at the empty metal ring. Last winter, when I had been down with a severe case of bronchitis that kept me in bed for 3 weeks, I had given Natalie my keys. I needed her to retrieve Curtis's old military discharge papers from the bank, so I could file for his VA burial benefit. When she brought the papers back, she had handed me the keyring, claiming she must have dropped the bank key in her car. She had promised to look for it, but she never mentioned it again, and I, in my exhaustion, had forgotten to follow up. She hadn't lost it. She had kept it. She had been carrying the key to my past in her purse for 12 months, waiting for the moment when she would need to open the door. At 8:45 p.m., I sat at the kitchen table, my cell phone in my hand. I dialed a number I had memorized 5 years ago, when Natalie first introduced him to the family. "Roy." He answered on the second ring. His voice wasn't angry or defensive. It was shaking, thin, and hollowed out by the same cold wind that had blown through my house. "Denise," he whispered, I was just about to call you. I didn't know if your phone was still working." "Where is Natalie, Roy?" I asked. "She's gone," he said, and I could hear the sound of him pacings on a hardwood floor, his breathing shallow. "She took my car, Denise. She took the keys while I was in the shower. I checked our joint account online 20 minutes ago. She transferred the entire balance, $9,000, to an offshore portal. She left a note on the kitchen island. It doesn't make any sense." What does the note say, Roy? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the sound of paper rustling, the dry, crisp sound of a page being smoothed down by a trembling hand. She said she's taking what she's owed, Roy read, his voice cracking. She said she spent 10 years being the family garbage disposal, listening to Mitchell's lies and your silence. But, Denise, there's something else. She wrote about the safety deposit box. Yes, I said. She took the bonds and the deed. But she said she found something else in there, Roy said, his voice dropping into a register of genuine confusion and fear. She said she found an envelope from 1993, a certified letter from a clinic in Chicago. She wrote, "Tell Mom I know about the other child. Tell her I'm going to find him." The air in my kitchen suddenly went very cold, as if the arched window had cracked open an inch. A mother's heart does not break all at once. It wears down like a stone under a waterfall, year after year, drop by drop, until one day she looks inside and realizes there is nothing left to crack. There is only a smooth, gray hollow where the water used to collect. Marianne stopped in the middle of the room, her eyes fixing on my face. She knew the year. She knew the city. She had been the only one who had stood in the waiting room of that brick clinic on a rainy Tuesday in October. 30 years ago, while Curtis sat in his car in the parking lot with the engine running. "Denise?" Roy's voice came through the small speaker of the phone, sounding very far away, like a voice calling from the bottom of a well. What does she mean? Who is she talking about? "Goodbye, Roy," I said quietly. "Make sure you file a report about your car. The police will need the license plate number." I hung up the phone. I laid it on the wooden table next to the small, empty key ring. I looked at Marianne. Her mouth was a thin, tight line, her eyes wide, with a question she had promised never to ask again as long as we both lived. "She has the letter, Marianne," I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "She has the name." The wind off the lake rose at midnight, bringing with it a fine, freezing drizzle that rattled against the arched windows of my new living room like handfuls of sand. Marianne sat in the armchair opposite me, her tea untouched on the small table between us. The steam had long stopped rising, leaving the surface of the amber liquid dark and still. She looked at her hands, her fingers still holding the dry, clean scent of the lavender cedar chest we had unpacked. "I thought we buried him, Denise," she said, her voice barely louder than the steady hiss of the steam radiator. "I thought when we drove back from Chicago in the snow, we agreed that the road only went one way." "We did," I said, looking at the dark pane of the window. But Curtis kept the map. In 1992, Curtis and I had separated for 8 months. It was a quiet, gray period in our marriage, a time when the silence in our suburban house had grown so heavy we couldn't hear our own voices over it. Curtis had taken an interim job at a manufacturing plant in South Chicago, living in a small, drafty apartment near the canal. During those months, he had met Sylvia, a quiet woman who worked as a clerk in the plant's shipping office. When Curtis came back to me in the spring of 1993, he didn't lie. He sat in our kitchen, his head in his hands, and told me that Sylvia was pregnant. The child, a boy, was born in October of that year. Sylvia had decided to place him for private adoption through a non-denominational clinic on the west side of the city. Curtis had signed the surrender papers, but because of his guilt, that heavy, stubborn anchor he carried until his heart finally failed him. He had insisted on keeping a copy of the final adoption decree. He had kept it in the safety deposit box, sealed in a plain brown envelope with the seal of the Cook County Family Court. "We keep secrets not to protect ourselves from the truth," I said, looking at Marianne. "We keep them to protect the people we love from realizing how much we had to forgive to keep them." "And now Natalie has it," Marianne said, her brow furrowing. "What is she going to do with it, Denise? She's 60 miles into Canada by now. Why would she care about a 30-year-old adoption file?" "Because Natalie has spent her life believing she was the only daughter of a perfect father," I said. "She loved Curtis because he never said no to her. She worshipped his memory because it was a shield she could use against me. But now she knows he was just another man who made a mess in the dark. She wants to use that boy to hurt me, Marianne. She wants to show me that the family I 40 years trying to hold together was a lie from the very beginning." On Saturday morning, the Oak Haven town square was empty. The rain had turned into a thick, wet snow that clung to the black branches of the maple trees. At 8:30, my cell phone hummed on the kitchen table. It was Calvin, the estate liquidator. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice coming through the speaker with the background noise of car engines and voices. "We've got a big crowd here. The tables are almost cleared, but, well, there's some trouble." "What kind of trouble, Calvin?" "Your daughter-in-law, Cheryl. She showed up about 30 minutes ago. She's not herself, Mrs. Miller. She's standing on the lawn, telling people they can't buy the dining table. She's claiming the estate is under legal dispute. My security guard is trying to keep her back, but she's making a scene. She's demanding to know where you are." "The table is sold, Calvin?" I asked. "Yes, ma'am. A gentleman from the historic district bought it for $400. He has his trailer backed up now, but Cheryl is sitting on the tailgate." "Tell the security guard to call the county sheriff, Calvin," I said quietly. "The quitclaim deed is filed. Cheryl has no legal interest in that property or its contents. If she refuses to leave, she is trespassing." There was a pause on the line. I could hear the sound of a woman's distant, frantic shouting through the receiver. A high, thin sound that was swallowed by the cold wind. "Are you sure, Mrs. Miller?" Calvin asked, his voice low. It's going to look bad. The neighbors are watching." "The neighbors have been watching for 30 years, Calvin," I said. "They might as well see the end of the play. Call the sheriff." I hung up. I walked to my arched window, looking down at the red cyclamen on the sill. The snow was falling faster now, turning the cobblestones of the square white. As I stood there, a small gray notification bar slid down the screen of my tablet, which was resting on the cedar chest. It was an email. I didn't have many people who knew my digital address. I had set it up 3 years ago to receive my bank statements and utility notifications. The sender's field didn't show a name, only a string of numbers followed by a generic server domain. The subject line was empty. I tapped the screen. The email contained no text, only a single attachment, a high-resolution digital photograph. I opened the image. It was a scanned copy of the Cook County Adoption Decree from October 12, 1993. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The purple ink of the clerk's stamp, faded but legible. Beneath the image, there was a single typed sentence from the sender. "Is this yours?" The email address from which the message had been sent ended in a Canadian suffix, .ca. I stared at the screen. The blue light from the tablet reflected in my eyes, cold and still. The past had not just been uncovered. It had actively reached out across 74 miles of highway, across the state line, across 30 years of silence to find me in my brick room. Marianne came out of the kitchen, a fresh cup of tea in her hand. She saw my face, saw the way I was holding the tablet, and she stopped in the middle of the room. "Denise," she whispered. "What is it?" "She found him, Marianne," I said. The snow continued to fall, thick and silent, wrapping Oakhaven in a white, heavy wool. By 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, the red brick buildings across the square were just dim shapes in the mist. I sat at my wooden kitchen table, the tablet open before me. The scanned adoption decree of October 1993 remained on the screen, its purple quartz seal looking like a cold bruise in the digital light. "Are you going to reply?" Marianne asked. She was standing behind me, her hand resting on the back of my chair, her fingers warm through my sweater. "Yes," I said. My fingers hovered over the glass keyboard. I didn't want to use the language of guilt. I didn't want to apologize for Curtis, and I didn't want to explain 30 years of marital silence to a man who had never heard my voice. I typed, "Yes, it is mine," or rather it was my late husband Curtis's. He kept it in his safety deposit box because he could never forget what he had left behind in Chicago. "If my daughter Natalie is with you, please know she did not seek you out of love. She is looking for a weapon to use against me. I am sorry she has brought our dark to your door." I pressed send. "You're very blunt," Marianne murmured. "He is 30 years old, Marianne," I said, closing the mail application. "He has lived 30 years without our family's lies. He doesn't need me to start feeding them to him now." At 3:30, the phone on the counter rang. I picked it up. It was Cheryl. Her voice was high, wet, and ragged, accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic thump of her car's windshield wipers. "They escorted me off the lawn, Denise," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the small receiver. "The deputy, that Warren man, he threatened to arrest me in front of the children. He said I was trespassing. Mitchell is in the county jail, Denise. They set his bail at $10,000. The lawyer says if we don't post it by Monday morning, they're going to transfer him to the maximum security unit in the city because of the larceny charge." "I know," I said, leaning against the counter. "I don't have $10,000, she sobbed. "I have $82 in my checking account. My mother won't lend me a cent. She says Mitchell is a parasite. You have the money, Denise. You have the deposit from the Oakhaven apartment and the estate sale. Calvin said the table sold for $400, and the tools. You must have thousands in cash right now. Please, he's your son. You can't let him spend the winter in a cell. The money from the estate sale belongs to the estate, Cheryl," I said. "And the estate has $30,000 in debts to clear because of the loan Mitchell defaulted on. I am not spending a single dollar to keep him out of jail." "You're a monster," she screamed, her voice cracking with a raw, ugly desperation. "He did what he did because we were drowning. We have kids, Denise. Do you want your grandchildren to go to school knowing their father is in prison? Your children already know their father is a thief, Cheryl, I said quietly. They learned it from the way you both spent money you didn't earn. The bail is Mitchell's first lesson in arithmetic. I suggest he starts counting. Before she could scream again, I hung up. I didn't feel the heat of anger in my chest. I felt only a dry, clean emptiness. The hardest part of letting a family fall apart is realizing that the people who built the walls are always the ones most surprised when the roof finally caves in on them. They expect you to stand in the ruins, holding up the timbers with your bare hands, while they complain about the dust. The tablet on the table made a soft, high-pitched chime. A new email had arrived from the .ca address. I opened it. Natalie is not with me anymore, Elliot wrote. His name, Elliot, was at the bottom of the message. It was the first time I had seen it written. She arrived at my apartment in Niagara Falls last night. She was manic, Mrs. Miller. She had a manila folder full of bonds and a gold medal with a silver star. She told me she was going to balance the ledger. She thought I'd be angry. She thought I'd want to join her in some kind of lawsuit against you. The text continued. I told her to leave. I don't want your husband's medals, and I don't want his money. I have a good life here. I work at the hydro plant. But before she left, she took a phone call in her car. I heard her through the open window. She was talking to someone named Roy. She told him she had a power of attorney document with your signature on it from 3 years ago, the one you signed when you had your surgery. She said she's going to the First National Bank branch in Buffalo on Monday morning. She's going to try to liquidate your main retirement annuity before you can flag the keys as stolen. My breath caught, just for a second. My main retirement annuity. It was the bulk of my life's savings, $86,000, held in a conservative trust account at the First National Bank of New York. In 2021, when I had been scheduled for double bypass surgery, I had signed a temporary, limited power of attorney naming Natalie as my agent, so she could pay my medical bills if I didn't wake up from the anesthesia. I had survived the surgery. I had returned to work. But I had never formally revoked the document with the bank's legal department. I had assumed in my foolish maternal trust that the document had expired with the medical discharge. It hadn't. It was still sitting in their system, a dormant silver key waiting for her to turn it. Buffalo was only 40 miles from the Niagara border crossing. She was already on the U.S. side, waiting for the bank doors to open on Monday morning. I looked at Marianne. Her face had gone pale as she read the screen over my shoulder. The Buffalo branch, she whispered. Denise, that's $86,000. If she takes that, you have nothing left but your part-time salary. The bank doesn't open until 9 o'clock on Monday morning, I said, my voice dropping into that cold, steady register. And today is Saturday. I reached for my keys on the table. Where are you going? Marianne asked, her hand reaching out to grab my sleeve. The roads are covered in snow, Denise. It's a 2-hour drive to the main office in the county seat, and they're closed until Monday. The county seat office is closed, I said, looking out the arched window at the snow-covered square. But the First National Emergency Fraud Hotline is open 24 hours. And I have the phone right here. I sat back down, my fingers dialing the toll-free number printed on the back of my debit card. The blue light of the tablet caught the edge of my gold wedding band, thin and worn, as the line began to ring. Thank you for calling First National Bank of New York Emergency Services. My name is Patrick. How can I help you today? The voice was young, professional, and slightly hollowed out by the white noise of a call center miles away. My name is Denise Miller, I said, holding the phone close to my ear. I have a retirement annuity trust with your institution. The account number is 840092. I need to report a fraudulent attempt to liquidate the funds. I can certainly look into that for you, Mrs. Miller, Patrick said. I can lock your digital portal access and freeze any pending debit card or ACH transactions immediately. Has there been unauthorized access to your username or password? No, I said. It's a physical attempt. My daughter, Natalie Miller, has a copy of a temporary medical power of attorney I signed in 2021 before a surgery. She is intending to present it at your Buffalo branch on Monday morning to liquidate the $86,000 in the annuity. There was a pause on the line, the sound of keyboard keys clicking softly. I see the power of attorney on file in our system, Mrs. Miller, Patrick said, his voice dropping into a more cautious, legalistic register. It was uploaded and verified in August of 2021. It does not have an expiration date listed in the system flags. It was a temporary medical document, I said. I never revoked it because I assumed it had expired upon my hospital discharge. A power of attorney is a legally binding document, Mrs. Miller, Patrick explained, his tone sympathetic but firm. Our weekend emergency line can freeze digital transactions, but we cannot unilaterally revoke a notarized POA that has already been verified by our legal department. Under federal regulations, if the agent listed on the document presents the original paperwork and proper identification at a branch, the teller is legally obligated to honor her request until a formal revocation is processed. How do I process a revocation? I asked. You need to submit a signed notarized Form 402, revocation of power of attorney, directly to a branch manager or our legal department. Once the manager receives the physical form, they can flag the account as disputed and freeze all POA transactions. But since it's Saturday, our legal department is closed. The earliest we can accept the form is Monday morning at 9 o'clock when the branch is open. I see, I said. Thank you, Patrick. I hung up the phone. I looked at Mary Ann. She was leaning against the kitchen counter, her face pale in the gray light of the snow. What did he say? She asked. He said a piece of paper signed in 2021 is stronger than my voice in 2024, I said quietly. Unless I can get a notarized revocation into the hands of the Buffalo branch manager before Natalie sits down at his desk. Buffalo is 3 hours from here, Denise, Mary Ann said, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. The highway is covered in ice. They're predicting another 3 inches of snow tonight. Then we'd better leave early, I said. We left Oak Haven at 5 o'clock on Sunday morning. The highway was a silent white ribbon under the headlights of my sedan. The salt trucks had been out, leaving the asphalt gray and crusted with brine that sprayed against my windshield in a dry white mist. I kept my hands at 10, and 2, my eyes fixed on the taillights of a distant semi-truck that was clearing a path through the snow. We didn't talk. The quiet in the car was the same quiet we had shared 30 years ago, on the long drive back from the clinic in Chicago. We were two sisters who knew that sometimes the only way to save yourself from your own blood is to keep driving through the dark. We arrived in Buffalo at 2 in the afternoon. The city was gray, cold, and buried under 2 feet of lake-effect snow. We checked into a modest 3-story motel on Delaware Avenue, less than half a mile from the stone building that housed the main Buffalo branch of First National Bank. The room smelled of old carpet, synthetic lavender, and the dry metallic heat of the radiator under the window. At 6 o'clock, my phone on the nightstand vibrated. It was a text message from Natalie. "You blocked my online login," she wrote. "You think you're so smart, Mom. You think you can just lock me out of everything. But I have the document. I have your signature and the notary's seal. I'm going to the Delaware Avenue branch at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'm taking what's mine. If you try to stop me, I'll tell the police about the Chicago file. I'll make sure everyone in Oak Haven knows what you did in 1993. I stared at the small screen. The blue light caught the wrinkles on my knuckles, the dry skin around my nails. She was manic. She was running on the raw, frantic energy of a cornered animal that believed its own survival depended on destroying the person who had fed it. I didn't reply. I turned off the phone, placed it in my purse, and sat on the edge of the motel bed, watching the snow fall against the yellow street lamp outside. Monday morning was 12 degrees. At 8:45 a.m., I parked my sedan in the small, salt-crusted parking lot of the First National Bank on Delaware Avenue. The building was an old, neoclassical stone structure with 4 heavy gray pillars that looked like frozen fingers clutching the sky. Marianne sat beside me, her hands tucked into her sleeves, her breath forming small white plumes of steam in the cold air of the car. I had the signed, notarized revocation of power of attorney form in my lap. I had found a notary at the motel's front desk on Sunday evening. An older woman who had stamped the paper with a dry, heavy click of her metal seal. "Is that her?" Marianne whispered, pointing a gloved finger toward the entrance of the parking lot. A red crossover turned in from the street, its tires crunching loudly over the frozen slush. It parked 3 spaces away from us, near the side entrance of the stone building. The engine died. The driver's door opened, and Natalie stepped out into the biting cold. She looked thin, her face gray and hollowed out by 3 days of driving. She wore her expensive wool coat, but it was unbuttoned, flapping in the freezing wind, exposing her rumpled gray sweatshirt beneath. She clutched her black leather tote bag against her ribs like a shield. She didn't see us. She marched straight toward the heavy glass doors of the bank, her boots squeaking sharply on the salt-covered pavement. I opened my car door, the 12-degree air hitting my face like a wet sheet. "Denise," Marianne said, her hand reaching out to grab my coat sleeve. "Be careful." "I'm just going to the bank, Marianne," I said quietly, stepping out onto the frozen ground. I closed the door, adjusted my coat, and walked toward the stone pillars, the white paper held firmly in my gloved hand. The double glass doors of the First National Bank were unlocked from the inside by a young man in a dark blue suit at precisely 9 o'clock. Natalie was the first to step inside, her boots clicking rapidly on the polished gray marble of the vestibule. I followed her, my footsteps silent on the heavy fiber mat at the entrance. The air inside was warm, smelling of brass polish, dry heat, and the clean, sterile scent of fresh copier paper. She turned around when she heard the second set of footsteps. Her face went completely white, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes fixed on me. She stood in the center of the lobby, her leather tote bag clutched against her ribs, her chest heaving under her unbuttoned coat. How are you here?" she whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes darting toward the security guard standing near the teller line. "You're supposed to be in Oakhaven. Mitchell said you didn't have your phone." "The road is open, Natalie," I said, my voice quiet, carrying no further than the space between us. "And Oakhaven is only 74 miles away." "I have the paper," she said, her voice dropping into a desperate rapid hiss as she took a step back toward the platform where the personal bankers sat behind low mahogany partitions. "I have the power of attorney, Mom. It's legal. You signed it. You can't just take it back because you're mad." "I can," I said. A gentleman in his early 50s, with a neat gray suit and a silver name tag that read Mr. Leonard. Assistant branch manager stepped out from one of the offices. He looked at us both, his eyes instantly catching the tension in Natalie's posture. The wild hair, the unbuttoned coat, the frantic, shallow breathing. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying the smooth, professional neutrality of a seasoned banker. "Is there something I can help you with today?" "I need to see a manager," Natalie said, pushing past me, her voice rising. "I have a verified power of attorney for the Denise Miller Annuity Trust. I need to execute a full liquidation of the funds today. It's an emergency. The principal is experiencing cognitive decline, and we need the funds for her medical care. Mr. Leonard looked at her, then his eyes flicked to me. He saw my coat, zipped neatly to my chin, my leather gloves, and the white paper held firmly in my hand. He saw my eyes, clear, cold, and perfectly still. "Please step into my office," he said, gesturing toward a room with a glass wall and a large cherrywood desk. We sat in 2 leather chairs opposite his desk. Natalie sat on the edge of her seat, her bag open in her lap, her fingers clawing through the papers inside. She pulled out the 2021 medical power of attorney, its blue notary backing slightly crumpled at the corners, and slit across the polished wood. "Here," she said, "it's in your system. We verified it 3 years ago. I have my ID right here." Mr. Leonard didn't look at her ID. He looked at me. "And you are Mrs. Denise Miller?" he asked. "I am," I said. I reached forward and placed the white Form 402 on top of Natalie's document. The notary stamp from the Oakhaven Motel was dry, clean, and dark. "This is a notarized revocation of power of attorney," I said, my voice steady, carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 22 years reading county billing codes. "It was executed yesterday evening. I am the principal of the Annuity Trust, and I am revoking all authority granted to Natalie Miller under the 2021 document. I would like the account flagged as sole access immediately." Mr. Leonard picked up both papers. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the signatures, the notary stamps, and the dates. He turned to his computer terminal, his fingers tapping rapidly on the keyboard. the low blue light of the screen reflecting in his glasses. Natalie was leaning forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You can't do that. She's not of sound mind, Mr. Leonard. Her son is in jail right now because she's been hiding family assets. She's liquidating her home of 30 years under distress. She's mentally unstable." "Ma'am, Mr. Leonard said, his eyes never leaving his screen. "The revocation is notarized. The signature matches our signature card on file from 2018. Under New York State banking law, a principal of sound mind may revoke a power of attorney at any time, for any reason, by submitting a written revocation." He clicked his mouse 3 times, a sharp final sound. "The system has been updated," he said, looking at me with a polite, professional smile. "The power of attorney is officially revoked, Mrs. Miller. The annuity is frozen to all third-party transactions. Only you can access these funds." "Thank you, Mr. Leonard," I said, standing up. Natalie sat frozen in her chair. The leather bag had slipped from her fingers, landing on the carpet with a soft, heavy thud. Her eyes were wide, dark, with a mixture of fury and a sudden sharp realization that she had run out of ground. She had no money, her boutique was cold, and her partner's bank account was empty. She was 60 miles from the Canadian border, with nothing in her purse but a handful of stolen papers. "You think you've won," she whispered, her voice trembling as she stood up, her face turning a blotchy, ugly red. "You think you're so safe with your $86,000. But I didn't just bring the papers to Elliot, Mom. I left a copy of the Chicago adoption documents on the desk of the Oak Haven County prosecutor on Friday afternoon. They're going to open an estate fraud investigation, Denise. Mitchell's lawyer is already using it to show you're an unfit executor who has been hiding family assets for years. The police are going to be waiting for you when you get back." I looked at her. I saw the daughter I had carried, now a middle-aged woman spitting threats in a bank office because she could no longer use my guilt to pay her bills. "Then it's a good thing I brought my sister, Natalie," I said quietly. "She was in the room in 1993. She remembers the truth." I turned and walked out of the office, my boots silent on the marble lobby. As I stepped through the heavy glass doors into the 12-degree air, the wind hit my face like cold water. Marianne was waiting for me in the sedan, the engine idling, a thin plume of exhaust rising into the gray sky. But as I reached the middle of the parking lot, another vehicle turned in from Delaware Avenue. It was a blue and white New York State police cruiser. It parked directly behind my sedan, its tires crunching over the frozen slush, the heavy rumble of its engine filling the quiet morning. The driver's door opened, and a tall trooper in a gray winter coat and a wide-brimmed hat stepped out onto the salt-covered pavement. He looked at my license plate, then at me. The trooper's boots crunched heavy and slow on the frozen salt of the parking lot. His breath rose in a thick white plume that the wind instantly whipped away. He stopped a few feet from me, his gloved hand resting lightly on the frame of his utility belt. "Mrs. Denise Miller?" he asked. His voice was deep, gravelly, and steady. "Yes," I said. "I'm Trooper Vance. I received a flag on your vehicle's plate from the sheriff's department down in your home county." He looked past me toward the bank's glass doors, then back to my face. "They've been trying to reach you. Your daughter-in-law, Cheryl Miller, was arrested 2 hours ago at your old property for criminal trespass and resisting officer orders. But that's not why I'm here." He pulled a small notepad from his pocket, the pages fluttering in the 12-degree wind. "A vehicle matching your daughter Natalie's description, registered to a Mr. Roy Vance, was flagged as stolen at the border crossing near Niagara Falls this morning. We received an alert that she might attempt to access this branch using disputed documents. Is she inside?" "She is," I said quietly, the paper of my power of attorney revocation still held in my hand. "The assistant branch manager, Mr. Leonard, has just processed the revocation. She has no authority over the accounts." Trooper Vance nodded once, a sharp clinical gesture. "I'm going to ask you to step back to your vehicle, Mrs. Miller. My partner and I will handle it from here." I walked back to my sedan. Marianne opened the passenger door, her eyes wide as I slipped into the driver's seat. We sat in the quiet warmth of the car, the engine idling, watching through the windshield as Trooper Vance and his partner stepped through the heavy glass doors of the bank. 10 minutes later, they came out. Natalie walked between them. She wasn't wearing handcuffs, but the younger trooper held her by the elbow, his grip firm and unyielding. Her leather tote bag was gone, likely held as evidence. Her head was bowed, her wild hair falling forward, hiding her face from the cold gray sky of Buffalo. She looked small, stripped of her glossy boutique armor, just a shivering young woman in a dirty sweatshirt, being led toward the back of a state police cruiser. She didn't look at my car. She didn't look at the stone pillars of the bank. She simply stepped into the back seat, and the door clicked shut. The cruiser backed out of the parking lot, its blue lights silent but persistent, disappearing into the Delaware Avenue traffic. Marianne reached over, her gloved hand covering mine on the steering wheel. "It's over, Denise." "Yes," I said, putting the car in gear. "Let's go home." The spring came to Oak Haven late, but when it arrived, it was clean. By May, the ice on the Great Lake had broken into massive, glittering sheets that drifted north, leaving the water dark, deep, and still. The air in the town square smelled of damp earth, fresh pine needles, and the cold, sharp wind off the harbor. My old house in the suburbs had sold in March. The proceeds of the sale were handled entirely by the estate liquidators and the bank's legal department. After Mitchell's $30,000 default was cleared, and the remainder of Curtis's secondary retirement account was settled, there was a modest sum left over. I didn't give it to my children. I placed it into a restricted trust for my grandchildren's education, managed by a neutral trustee in Oak Haven. Neither Mitchell nor Natalie would ever be able to touch the principal. Mitchell's received a 2-year suspended sentence and 3 years of probation, avoiding prison only because the credit union agreed to a restitution schedule. He had moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner's, his logistics company gone, his late model truck repossessed. He worked 40 hours a week as a dispatcher for a regional gravel company, paying off his court-ordered debts $50 at a time. Natalie's boutique had closed its doors in January. She had pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of unauthorized use of a motor vehicle and was serving probation in New York. She had taken a job as a clerk at a department store in Niagara Falls, living in a small room near the train tracks. They didn't call me. They didn't text. The silence that lay between us was no longer the tense, heavy silence of things left unsaid. It was the quiet of a field after a fire has burned itself out, leaving only cold ash and stone. On a Saturday afternoon in late May, I sat by the arched window of my brick apartment. The red cyclamen on the sill had survived the winter, its dark green leaves thick and healthy. 3 new red petals reaching upward toward the spring sun. Marianne had gone down to her bookstore, leaving me alone in the quiet room. I opened my tablet. There was a single email in my inbox, sent from the CA address. "Dear Denise," Elliot wrote, "I wanted to let you know that I'm doing well. The spring has been warm here. I don't want anything from you. No money, no explanations. But Marianne told me you sometimes come down to the harbor on Saturdays. If you're ever near the lake, I'd like to buy you a cup of tea. Just to talk about the wind, Elliot." I looked at the screen for a long time. I didn't reply immediately, but I didn't delete the message. I left it open, the blue light soft in the warm afternoon. I looked down at my left hand. The gold wedding band Curtis had bought me in 1984 was thin, worn down by 40 years of dishwater and laundry detergent. I reached down, my fingers catching the edge of the gold. It was tight, sticking slightly at the knuckle, but with a firm, quiet pull, it slid off. The skin beneath it was pale, showing a thin white circle where the gold had been. I placed the ring in a small blue porcelain dish on the windowsill, next to the red cyclamen. The kitchen was silent. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic cry of the gulls down by the harbor. I stood up, put on my light spring sweater, and walked out the door, leaving the keys on the table. She had spent decades holding everyone together, until she finally realized nobody was holding her. And as I stepped out into the clean spring air of Oakhaven, the wind off the lake felt light, cool, and entirely free.